What happens when the ice gives back something that should not exist? By late August, the glacier above Berchtesgaden had begun to sound less like ice and more like an old house settling around a hidden wound. Water ran beneath its surface in thin metallic streams. Cracks opened and closed with the slow patience of something alive. Under the hard white glare of the afternoon sun, the meltwater flashed like broken glass, and every exposed stone seemed too dark, too clean, too newly returned to the world. The research team working the lower edge of the ice field had become used to small revelations. Rusted pitons, fragments of canvas, a spoon, a buckle, a length of weathered rope. The mountain had been swallowing and releasing objects for generations. Nothing it offered was ever kind, but most of it was understandable. It belonged to storms, bad steps, thin air, and the ordinary arithmetic of alpine loss. Then one of the younger researchers struck metal beneath a shelf of compacted blue ice. He expected another crampon, perhaps a cooking tin, another remnant from some forgotten accident. Instead, he uncovered a camera sealed inside a hardened sleeve of silt and frozen sediment, its leather case preserved with such unnatural care that it looked less buried than stored. The body was an old Nikon, scarred at the edges but intact. Even the strap remained supple. There was no sign of crushing, no fractured lens, no water damage that should have followed 30 winters beneath moving ice. The young man called for his supervisor. They photographed the find, logged the coordinates, and placed the camera into a transport case. A procedure, a line in a report, another object for cataloguing, but one woman on the team, a climate researcher named Dr. Miriam Voss, did not write the discovery down immediately. She turned the camera over in gloved hands and noticed something so small that it felt absurd to mention it. Mud from the present melt had dried across the buckle, yet beneath that mud, tucked into the seam of the leather case, there remained a grain of yellow pollen. At that altitude, there should have been none. Miriam said nothing, not then, not while the others packed equipment into crates and argued about helicopter transport schedules, not while the sun fell behind the sharpened ridges of the Votsman and the whole glacier went from white to silver to the color of ash. But that night, in a temporary lab container trembling softly in the wind, she opened the case again under a lamp and found the film still inside. A 35mm roll, astonishingly dry. By any ordinary standard, it should have been ruined. 3 days later, in a private laboratory in Munich, the negatives were developed. And in a village south of Salzburg, a retired man who no longer opened unfamiliar mail stood in his narrow hallway and stared at an unmarked envelope on the floorboards. Klaus Reinhardt had lived alone for 11 years. His routines were now arranged with the precision of a man who trusted repetition more than sleep. He rose before dawn. He boiled coffee in the same dented pot he had taken on winter rescue operations in his 30s. He listened to the weather report even on clear mornings. He kept his boots by the door, clean, repaired and ready, though no one called him into the mountains anymore. At 58, his shoulders had begun to slope, but the rest of him still carried the geometry of command. He moved carefully, as if every floorboard might be unstable terrain. The old injury in his left knee announced rain several hours before the clouds arrived. His hands were broad, scarred, and habitually still. He had once coordinated alpine search and rescue operations across some of the most unforgiving ground in Bavaria. For 2 decades, people had trusted his judgment at the edge of storms, on broken ridgelines, in ravines where a delayed decision could cost a life. He had made hundreds of calls. Most had been right. One had not. In February 1994, 4 experienced mountaineers vanished during a whiteout near the upper approaches beneath the Votsman Massif. They were not tourists. They were not reckless. They were known in the region, respected for discipline and preparation. When the storm closed in, Klaus led the first phase of the response, then ordered the broader search suspended after conditions deteriorated beyond reason. Wind velocities rose, visibility collapsed. The helicopters could not stay stable. Cornices shifted under fresh load. 2 rescuers nearly went down in a slab release before dawn. So he called it. He had told the families what men in his position always told families, that there would be another window. That mountain weather sometimes stole time, but not necessarily hope. That people had survived worse. No one was found. Over the years, the facts hardened into public memory, but never into peace. 4 names on memorial plaques, 4 photographs clipped into anniversary articles. A storm, a disappearance, a search that ended when it had to. That was the official shape of the story. It was not the shape Klaus lived with. He bent slowly, picked up the envelope and turned it over. No return address, no postmark he recognized. His name had been typed, not written. Inside were 6 glossy photographs and a short note printed on plain paper. You were there at the beginning. You need to see how it ended. He read the sentence twice before laying the note on the small oak table beneath his hallway mirror. Outside, rain tapped against the window in a faint, irregular pattern. Somewhere in the neighboring street, a delivery van reversed with a soft electronic chime. The ordinary world continued without hesitation. Klaus looked at the first photograph. At first, he thought the developer had made an error. The image showed 4 figures in alpine gear crossing a wide valley under brilliant daylight. The framing was documentary in style, almost casual. One hiker glancing over his shoulder, another kneeling near a patch of low vegetation, a third raising an arm against the brightness. Behind them rose slopes of pale stone and dark green growth, not snow-powdered firs clinging to Bavarian ridges, not scrub or exposed moss, but dense, temperate vegetation spread across a basin too broad and too gentle to belong anywhere near where they had vanished. Klaus brought the photograph closer. He recognized the red shell jacket worn by Matthias Ebner, the oldest of the missing climbers. He recognized a blue rucksack patched near the left strap with black tape. He recognized Karin Vogel's wool headband, absurdly light for winter conditions, because one of the family members had mentioned it through tears during the search. These were not strangers arranged into a trick image. These were the 4 missing mountaineers, and they were not walking through any place that existed on a map of the Alps. His fingers tightened on the glossy edge. The second image showed them beside a stream running over stones the color of old bone. One of the men had his gloves off. Another was smiling into the distance, not with relief, but with distracted wonder, as if something beyond the frame had interrupted whatever fear they had carried into the storm. In the third photograph, Karin crouched beside a cluster of tall ferns and broad-leafed plants shining in the light. Klaus was no botanist, but even he could see the vegetation was wrong. Too lush, too healthy, too impossible for high winter elevation. The leaves had the prehistoric extravagance of illustrations in museum books. Nothing about them belonged beneath a February sky at nearly 2,000 meters. He felt the room contract around him. The fourth image was the one that made him sit down. The 4 hikers stood at the edge of a meadow-like clearing, all facing the same direction. Their shadows stretched behind them across dry ground. But a second line of shadow cut across the stones at a different angle, sharper and darker, as though another sun had been shining from somewhere lower and to the east. Klaus set the photograph down very carefully. He had seen hallucinations in the mountains, snow blindness, oxygen confusion, men convinced they heard church bells inside avalanche debris, women who spoke calmly to rescuers who had been dead for hours. He respected what cold and fear could do to the human mind. But film was not supposed to hallucinate. He looked again at the note. No signature, nothing to identify the sender. Only at the bottom, almost too faint to notice, one final typed line. They are taking everything from the site. Trust no official explanation. Klaus stood, crossed to the window, and parted the curtain with 2 fingers. The street lay damp and empty under the evening light. Parked cars, a dripping gutter, a woman in a yellow coat locking her bicycle near the pharmacy. Nothing else, nothing wrong. Yet the old instinct rose inside him with humiliating speed. The instinct that had once told him when weather was turning before the barometer confirmed it, when a search zone had been drawn too narrow, when a witness had omitted one critical detail out of shame or fear. He returned to the table and spread the photographs in order. For 30 years, he had believed the mountain had buried 4 people in the blind violence of a storm. Cruel but explainable, final but human. Now the ice had given back a different story. And whatever had been hidden in those images was large enough, impossible enough, that someone had risked sending them to the one man who had failed to bring the climbers home. When the telephone rang a few seconds later, Klaus already knew the night had changed. He let it ring once, twice, 3 times. Then he saw, reflected in the darkened window, that his front gate was standing open. Felicitaten, file 0. The gate remained open for reasons too small to dismiss and too ordinary to explain. Klaus stood in the narrow wash of yellow light from the hallway and listened to the telephone continue its patient ringing from the kitchen. Outside, the rain had thickened. It now moved across the street in slanted threads, silver under the lamp near the corner. The latch on the gate stirred once in the wind, then went still again. He had locked it before sunset. Of that, he was certain. The phone stopped. Silence followed, dense enough to seem staged. Not the gentle silence of a country street in bad weather, but the kind that appeared after an interruption, when something waited to see whether it had been noticed. Klaus did not step outside at once. That was not caution born of fear. It was the old rescue discipline returning in him with humiliating ease, the instinct to study before moving, to let the scene settle into its own honesty. He switched off the hallway lamp. The house darkened around him, and the reflection in the window vanished. Beyond the glass, the garden fence, the wet pavement, the open gate, and the row of dark hedges emerged more clearly. No figure stood there, no vehicle pulled away, no motion at all except the weather. Only then did he walk to the kitchen, where the telephone sat on the wall above a folded dish towel and a bowl containing 3 apples he had not yet thrown away. The display showed no number. The line had been silent long enough to feel deliberate. He did not call back because there was nothing to call. Instead, he took a pencil from the drawer, wrote down the exact time, then returned to the table where the photographs lay. He looked at them again in the harsher light of the kitchen ceiling lamp, forcing himself to study rather than react. He had spent years teaching younger coordinators that panic often hid inside wonder. A strange detail could pull the mind away from structure, from sequence, from what could still be measured. So he began with what he knew. The hiker's clothing was correct for the 1994 expedition. The camera angle suggested one of the 4 had taken the pictures, possibly Matthias, who had carried a Nikon according to the original equipment list. The film stock appeared authentic for the period. The shadows were wrong. The vegetation was wrong. The terrain was wrong. But the people were right. That alone made the images more dangerous than any obvious forgery. He spread an old notepad beside the photographs and began recording details in block letters. Jacket colors, pack configurations, glove types, estimated spacing between the subjects, direction of visible light, condition of ground surface. He wrote down the date of the disappearance, 14th of February 1994. He wrote down the weather bulletin from memory, then corrected himself, irritated by the imprecision. Memory was not evidence. Not anymore. That thought stayed with him longer than it should have. For the past 3 decades, Klaus had lived inside a careful architecture built against memory's failures. His house was orderly because disorder suggested forgetting. His cupboards were labeled because unlabeled things had a way of becoming lost. He kept folders in the study with clipped articles, search maps, weather copies, helicopter logs, and transcripts from the 1994 operation, not because he expected to solve anything after so long, but because the alternative was worse. The alternative was allowing the past to dissolve into the soft, self-protective blur that age offered as mercy. He had never wanted mercy. After retirement, people assumed he spent his days drifting between walking trails, medical appointments, and the stale half-freedom of provincial old age. They did not know that every Thursday morning he still laid out topographic sheets across the dining table and traced historical routes with his finger. They did not know he still woke from the same recurring dream, radio static, then voices he could not identify, then 4 dark figures moving through blowing snow toward a place he could never quite see. His ordinary life, if it could be called that, had narrowed into habits built around avoidance and atonement. He bought groceries at 7:30 before the school traffic clogged the village road. He sharpened kitchen knives with more concentration than the task required. He attended no Alpine Club reunions. He ignored invitations from former colleagues unless illness or death made absence unforgivable. On clear days, he walked short distances along the lower paths above the river, where the mountains remained visible but not intimate. He told people his knee no longer allowed serious climbing. That was true. It was not the whole truth. The whole truth was that Klaus no longer trusted himself on high ground, not because he feared falling, because he feared remembering too much. The 4 missing climbers had names that never quite became past tense in his mind. Matthias Ebner, 39, a secondary school teacher from Rosenheim, methodical, experienced, the natural planner of the group. Karin Vogel, 32, a landscape architect from Munich, known for long winter traverses and a habit of carrying a notebook even in storm season. Uwe Hartner, 46, a municipal surveyor with military-level endurance and the unhelpful confidence of a man who believed maps could solve weather. And Daniel Seifert, 29, youngest of them, a competent climber with less winter exposure than the others, but enough to be included without protest. They had signed out from a hut, checked their route, and moved into the upper range just before the forecast closed down. Nothing in their planning had suggested recklessness. That had always been part of the wound. They were not fools swallowed by vanity. They were good people caught in conditions that turned lethal faster than expected. At least that was the version Klaus had learned to live beside. Now those photographs sat under his lamp and made that version feel rehearsed. He went to the study and unlocked the lower metal cabinet beneath the shelves. Inside, arranged with institutional neatness, were the remnants of a career that had never fully ended inside him. Bound incident files, laminated route overlays, old radio call sheets, weather reproductions. A sealed envelope containing personal notes he had written in the months after the search and never reread. He pulled out the folder marked Watzmann, FAB 1994. The cardboard had faded from dark blue to a soft bureaucratic grey. His own handwriting on the tab looked unfamiliar now, firmer, straighter, less hesitant than the hand he used today. He carried the file back to the kitchen and set it beside the photographs. The pages smelled faintly of dust and old toner. He turned through initial alert times, volunteer logs, helicopter restrictions, avalanche warnings, team assignments. There was the operations diagram with the outer sectors marked in green and the aborted upper sweep in red. There were the signatures of men now dead, retired, or too old to speak of the mountains without lowering their eyes. He found the inventory list taken from the climber's registration and paused. Camera, Nikon FM2, 35mm black body. Film, Kodak Tri-X, 400 ASA, estimated 2 rolls. The room seemed to lose a degree of warmth. 2 rolls. The anonymous sender had mailed only developed prints. No negatives, no canister, no explanation of whether the film came from 1 roll or both. Klaus looked back at the photographs. 6 prints, too few for a full excursion, too many for accidental exposures. Whoever had handled the camera after its recovery had made choices before the images reached him. Selected, curated, perhaps censored. The thought left a cold, granular sensation at the back of his neck. He returned to the file and found another page he had not expected to matter. A witness summary from the day before the climbers vanished. A hut warden recalled Karin asking whether anyone knew of a lower passage not marked on common tourist maps. At the time, the remark had meant little. Many climbers asked bad questions in alpine weather, hunting for shortcuts that did not exist. Klaus himself had dismissed it in 1994 as the kind of vague inquiry people made while comparing routes over tea. But tonight the line seemed to lean up from the page. A lower passage, not a summit route, not a ridge. A passage. He read the statement twice more, then checked the follow-up notation. None. The storm had broken over the search, and that thin detail had sunk beneath urgent realities. On the next page, attached with a rusting staple, was a photocopy of Karin Vogel's emergency contact card. On the back, in hurried pencil, someone had copied 1 line from a conversation at the trailhead. If the fog closes, we drop below the line and keep moving until we find open ground. Klaus stared at the sentence without fully understanding why it unsettled him more than the photographs. Find open ground. As if someone had expected it to be there, the rain continued. A motorbike passed on the road and faded. Pipes in the wall clicked softly as the heating shifted. The normal sounds of a house alone at night. Yet with each page he turned, that ordinary shelter felt less persuasive. He closed the folder, then opened it again. He was not ready to stop. At 10:30, he made fresh coffee he did not want. He drank it standing. Then he carried the photographs to the desk in his study and placed them beneath the articulated lamp he once used for map reading. He took out a magnifier. The first image yielded nothing new beyond texture and distance. The second showed wet stones, braided water, and the edge of one boot. The third, the image with the plants, held more. Karin's left hand rested near one of the broad leaves. On her ring finger, she still wore the silver band her sister had described after the disappearance. The detail was painfully intimate. It made the impossible valley feel less like an artifact and more like a moment stolen from living time. Then he noticed something in the background. At first he thought it was damage to the print, a thin vertical interruption near the edge of the frame, half hidden behind foliage and blur. He angled the photograph closer to the lamp. Not damage, not a branch either. The line was too straight, too uniform, its edge catching light with a smoothness nature rarely produced in alpine country. Metal, perhaps, or painted composite, something manufactured. In the final photograph, the one with the contradictory shadows, he searched the far ridge beyond the clearing and found another impossible detail. The slope behind the hikers was not entirely natural. A section of the rock face curved with a geometric regularity that made no geological sense. Subtle, almost invisible, but present. It was the kind of contour the eye might ignore outdoors and the mind might erase later, a wall hidden in landscape, or a structure hidden as rock. Klaus sat back slowly. He did not believe in fantasies. Not secret kingdoms in the Alps, not supernatural openings in storms, not the desperate folklore mountain villages built around loss. But he believed in institutions lying. He believed in projects buried under official language. He believed in military experiments, sealed archives, and authorities who preferred a dead hiker to an unanswered question. And he believed, above all, in terrain. Terrain did not improvise. A valley either existed or it did not. So if the photographs were genuine, and if the terrain in them did not exist, then either the images had been staged somewhere else, or someone had hidden an entire geography inside the mountain. Near midnight, he rose from the desk and went once more to the front window. This time the gate was closed. He was certain he had not gone out to close it. For several seconds he simply watched the latch shine in the rain. Then he noticed the smaller thing. On the interior wall beside the umbrella stand, where he had left one of his old folded rescue maps after returning from the cellar. The map now lay turned 90 degrees to the right, aligned neatly with the edge of the table. Klaus had not moved it. And the front door, though still locked, was no longer double-latched the way he always left it before opening unfamiliar mail. By morning, the house had regained its usual appearance, and that made everything worse. The rain had passed in the night. The windows held a cold grey light, thin and metallic, the kind that flattened distance and made the neighbouring roofs look cut from old tin. Nothing inside the kitchen appeared disturbed. The apples were still in the bowl. The pencil remained where Klaus had left it. The photographs lay stacked on the table with the false calm of ordinary paper. Only the map, now returned to the angle he remembered, refused to become harmless again. He stood over it for a long time without touching it. A topographic sheet from the eastern approaches, faded at the folds, annotated in his own hand during the winter of 1994. He knew every crease, every coffee stain, every penciled mark where search teams had been redirected after the weather broke apart. If someone had entered the house, they had done almost nothing. No drawers opened, no lock forced, no object missing, no threat left behind, only a realignment. It was the kind of message a careless man would miss, and a careful man would never forget. Klaus made breakfast because hunger had its own authority, even in bad mornings. He sliced dark bread, boiled an egg, and ate standing at the counter while staring at the photographs propped against the kettle. Their impossible light made the room feel poorly built, as though his kitchen belonged to one world and the prints to another. When he finished, he washed the plate immediately. Then he carried the expedition file and the photographs into the study and shut the door. If there was a way to survive the next step, it was the same way he had survived weather decisions, body recoveries, and 20 years of radio voices on broken mountainsides. He would begin with facts, however small. He started with the film, not the images themselves, not yet, but the object that had produced them. In the 1994 inventory, the The camera and film stock had been listed during the climber's registration at the hut. Matthias had been carrying Kodak Tri-X 400. The old line remained unremarkable on the page until Klaus pulled a metal ruler from his desk drawer and laid it beside the prints. Tri-X produced a certain density and grain structure in enlargement, or so he remembered from evidence work on older accident files. He could not verify it alone, but he knew someone who might. He hesitated before picking up the telephone. Hannah Seidel had once been the least sentimental forensic imaging technician in southern Bavaria. During the last years of Klaus's career, she had consulted on accident reconstructions, film enhancement, and the miserable business of trying to read truth out of damaged photographs. She had retired to Augsburg, painted landscapes nobody saw, and answered calls only when she wished to. The two of them had not spoken in almost 4 years. When she answered, her voice was flatter than he remembered. "Klaus?" "Yes. That usually means either a funeral or a problem." "This is not a funeral." She was quiet for a moment. "Then it is the other thing." By noon, he was on the regional train north, a hard case on his lap containing copies of the prints and the original file notes he was willing to show. He had left the house locked, checked the latch twice, and carried the old map with him rather than leaving it behind. Through the train window, the Bavarian landscape moved in damp greens and washed-out fields, church spires, low industrial edges, villages sitting under a sky too pale to commit to weather. He did not sleep. Instead, he wrote down the questions that had begun to crowd each other during the night. Could the photographs have been taken somewhere outside Germany and loaded into the camera later? Could the film have been swapped after the disappearance? If so, by whom and for what purpose? If the hikers were indeed the missing 4, where had the photographs been taken? And why had an anonymous researcher sent them to him rather than the police, the press, or the families? The final question he did not write, though it remained the truest one. Had someone chosen him because of guilt, or because he had been expected to understand something others would not? Hannah's studio occupied the rear level of a converted warehouse near the river, a place that smelled faintly of fixer, dust, and old paper, despite the years since she had worked professionally. She opened the door in a thick wool cardigan, her silver hair tied back, her expression already sharpened into reluctant concentration. "You look older," she said. "So do you." "That is because I am older. Come in." She did not waste time on sympathy. He respected her for that. The studio was lined with flat files, light tables, framed prints turned toward the wall, and a magnification setup more advanced than he had expected from a retiree. He laid the copies down first. She looked at them without comment, then held one under the lamp. Her eyes narrowed. She reached for a loupe. "Where did these come from?" "I don't know." "That is not a useful beginning. It is the true one." She studied the first print in silence, then the second, then the final image with the double shadows. He watched her move through skepticism into something harder to read. "These aren't modern digital composites," she said at least not as prints. If someone manipulated them, they did it earlier in the chain, probably on the negative or during capture. The grain is consistent. Contrast too. Could the film be original to 1994? It could. That's not the same as saying it is. She switched on a second lamp, brighter and colder, and angled the final photograph beneath it. "The shadows are real," she said. Klaus felt the words more than heard them. Meaning? Meaning this is not a simple printing artifact. Something in the scene produced 2 directional light sources, one stronger, one slightly lower. The secondary edge is too coherent to be accidental flare. Could snow reflect enough? No, she cut him off with a glance. Not like this, not over that span. She moved to the third photograph, the one where Karin crouched beside the plants. "And these?" He waited. "These do not look like alpine vegetation. I know." "No. You know they look wrong. I'm saying they look botanically wrong. The leaf structure is too broad for that climate, that season, that altitude. You should show these to a paleobotanist, not a police lab." The word landed strangely in the room. Paleobotanist, the past pressing forward through plant shapes. Hannah enlarged a small section of the image and frowned. "There's pollen here." "On the print?" "No, not physically. Clinging to fabric. See this residue on the trouser hem? It could be dust, but I doubt it. Klaus thought immediately of the grain of yellow pollen Dr. Miriam Voss had found in the seam of the camera case, though he still did not know her name or what she had seen before sending the envelope. A second fact now leaned against the first. Hannah noticed his expression. "You already knew something, only that the camera came out of ice. Then the preservation alone is a problem. Glacial pressure should have done more damage unless it was shielded, sealed, or stored in void space." Void space. Yes, cavities, air pockets, crevasse chambers, man-made hollows, if you want to be imaginative. Klaus looked back at the photographs. In mountain rescue work, imagination was a dangerous word. It rescued some lives and ruined others. You needed enough of it to understand what frightened people might do under pressure, but not so much that every sound became a signal and every rumor a lead. Yet what the images suggested could not be approached without some willingness to think past habit. He took out the old topographic sheet and spread it on Hannah's table. The Watzmann Massif unfolded between them in contour lines, shaded relief, route notations and sector grids drawn during the 1994 operation. Klaus placed the first photograph beside the map, then the second, then the final image. He pointed at the visible rock formations in the background. "These ridges should tell me where they stood," he said. "If the terrain is real, there should be a match somewhere." Hannah gave him a doubtful look. "Unless the match is buried, altered, or never public. Terrain still leaves relationships, angles, distances, drainage patterns." "You're thinking like a man trying to prove the mountain lied," he answered without lifting his eyes from the photograph. "I'm thinking like a man who once trusted it more than people." Hannah said nothing after that. She made copies at higher resolution, then transferred them into a rendering program she still kept for archival work. The screen filled with sharpened lines, layered contrast maps, and edge-enhanced textures. Stone outcrops emerged, slope breaks, water channels, the curve of a distant ridge. Klaus leaned in until the muscles in his neck began to stiffen. Then he saw it. Near the right edge of the second photograph, behind Daniel's shoulder, a formation of pale rock rose in 3 blunt tiers, each slightly offset from the one below. On its own, it meant nothing. In the map overlays, it meant possibility. He pulled a stack of more recent digital terrain models from his case. Since retirement, he had kept updated relief prints, mostly out of habit, occasionally out of stubbornness. He compared ridge structures, glacial retreat lines, and exposed bedrock zones from the last decade. The 3-tier formation appeared nowhere on the public map sheets in open terrain. But there was one area where the retreat lines had changed dramatically in the last 15 years, a sector above the older eastern ice, close to a region that had long been marked unstable, inaccessible, and poorly surveyed during heavy seasons. He circled it in pencil. "This zone," he said. Hannah looked from the map to the photograph. "That's not enough." "It's the first thing that isn't nothing." By late afternoon, another pattern emerged. In 3 of the photographs, background slopes suggested a basin shape wider than any mapped depression in that section of the Alps. But the relationships between the visible rock faces and the apparent open ground made sense if one assumption changed. The valley floor was not lower than the surrounding slopes. It was enclosed, hidden inside the mountain's own geometry. Hannah sat back and folded her arms. "You're trying to locate an unmapped chamber using photos from a dead expedition and a retired rescue man's memory. Yes." "You hear how that sounds?" "Yes." She hesitated, then reached for the final image again. "There's one more thing." She enlarged the far background until the shapes broke into grain, then she adjusted the exposure. The clearing behind the hikers brightened, and along the upper edge of the frame a line appeared so faint, Klaus almost missed it. Not rock, not shadow, a straight interruption, slightly curved at one end, with repeated vertical intervals along its length. Like vents, or a railing, or some industrial structure half buried beyond the visible field. Klaus felt the old interior tightening he used to feel when radio reports began aligning against hope. A hidden space, wrong vegetation, preserved film, double shadows. None of it proved anything by itself. Together, they formed something worse than proof. A direction. Hannah printed the enhanced sections and slid them across the table. "If you continue, do it properly. Speak to geology first. then botany, then someone with access to restricted land surveys. Restricted? She gave him a dry look. You think every contour in this country has always been public? He packed the copies in silence. At the station, dusk had already begun to gather in the glass roof and on the tracks below. Klaus boarded the return train with the new enlargements tucked inside his case and the penciled circle on the map still fresh enough to smudge. He chose a seat near the rear carriage and watched the platform slide away. Only after the train cleared the city did he notice the man 3 rows ahead. Mid-40s, close-cropped hair, dark field jacket. Too well built to pass for office work, too still to be casual. He never turned fully around, but his reflection in the window showed enough. He was watching without appearing to watch. Klaus lowered his eyes to the photograph in his hand. On the back of the print copy Hannah had made, a faint line of type had appeared when the studio lamp struck it at an angle. Text impressed from pressure, too shallow to see before. He tilted the page closer. Not a note, not a signature, a file stamp. Archive transfer authorized, Karpaten Geologische System. Klaus looked up. The man ahead had finally turned his head. The man did not smile. He only held Klaus's gaze for a second longer than courtesy allowed, then turned back toward the darkening window as if the moment had meant nothing at all. Outside, the last of the evening light had thinned into a bruised blue over the fields. Farmhouses flickered past in brief yellow rectangles. Between them stretched long black strips of wet land, broken now and then by stands of trees and the faint red pulse of distant signal lights. Klaus slid the print halfway into the folder and kept his hand resting on it. Karpaten Geologische Systeme. He had never heard the name before, yet it sounded old in the modern way, engineered to feel technical, transnational, legitimate. Not a university, not a police archive, not a museum, a private firm by the shape of it. Geological systems, the kind of language used by consultancies that acquired access to land, data, and silence. The stamp alone proved little. It could have been a contractor handling glacier recovery, a lab moving material through routine channels, an administrative chain too dull to matter. But dull institutions did not usually send silent watchers onto trains. And dull institutions did not leave anonymous warnings telling retired rescue coordinators to trust no official explanation. Klaus kept his attention on the window for the rest of the journey, using the reflection instead of direct observation. The man remained motionless, except for small changes of posture at each stop. He got off one station before Klaus stepped onto the platform without luggage and disappeared into the shallow crowd without once looking back. That, more than anything, made the encounter feel organized. At home, the air inside the house was stale and slightly colder than outside. Klaus locked the door, checked the windows, and stood in the kitchen without removing his coat. The familiar rooms no longer felt protective. They felt searchable, interpretable, a geometry another person might already understand better than he did. He made no coffee that evening. He wanted his mind unsoftened. Instead, he laid everything out again. The original photographs, Hannah's enhancements, the 1994 operations file, the topographic sheet with the penciled circle above the eastern ice and a blank pad for names. Then he wrote one question across the top page in large block letters. Who else saw this first? Not the anonymous sender. Earlier than that. Somebody in 1994 had heard Karen ask about a lower passage. Somebody had written down the remark and failed to follow it. That much the file showed. But if the photographs were real, then either the hikers themselves had been looking for something before the storm, or someone had pointed them toward it. The thought carried him back into the old records with a sharper eye than the night before. Search files from an active rescue operation always contained a second history beneath the official one. The surface history was dates, routes, weather, orders, equipment, signatures. Beneath it lived hesitations, omissions, side remarks, statements made too early to seem important and too late to be fully trusted. In 1994, Klaus had read everything once under pressure and twice under fatigue. This time he read as a man with nothing left to lose except the comfort of his own mistakes. Near midnight, he found a name he had not spoken aloud in nearly 20 years. Josef Brandner, former ranger, occasional mountain guide, known to most in Berchtesgaden simply as Sepp. He had assisted in the outer search sectors during the first 3 days after the disappearance, mostly because nobody alive knew the unofficial deer paths and service tracks around the eastern slopes better than he did. Sepp had been difficult, proud and superstitious in the way old mountain men sometimes were. Not childish, never theatrical, but unwilling to believe that a map contained the whole truth of a place. In the operations file, Klaus found 2 references to him. The first was practical. Delivered local access notes regarding unstable snow bridges and abandoned maintenance routes. The second was stranger. Volunteer recommendation not adopted. Suggested visual sweep below eastern moraine line based on wind shadow behavior and old ground memory. Klaus read the sentence twice, then turned to the attached margin note in his own handwriting. Brandner agitated. No evidence. Prioritize aerial sectors when weather permits. He shut his eyes. He could hear the room from 1994 as if it still existed around him. The crackle of radios, wet gloves on tables, exhausted men talking over each other. The pressure to allocate bodies and hours where survival odds still seemed measurable. In that atmosphere, Sepp's language would have sounded infuriating. Old ground memory. Wind shadow behavior. The sort of mountain mysticism Klaus had trained himself never to indulge. But Sepp had not suggested a summit search. He had suggested looking below the eastern moraine line. Below. Klaus opened the village directory on his shelf, then cursed himself for the impulse. Sepp would be nearly 80 now, if alive. The printed number was no longer valid. He went to the hallway drawer, found the newer regional book, and searched again. Nothing. He spent the next hour calling people he disliked speaking to. A former district clerk, a retired volunteer coordinator, an ex-paramedic who remembered funerals better than living men. At last, shortly after 1 in the morning, he reached the widow of an old hut-keeper who had once known every stubborn soul on the mountain. Sepp Brandner, she said after a pause, still alive, unless the mountain has taken him at last. Bad lungs, lives out near Engadé in his sister's old place, keeps to himself. She gave Klaus the address, and before hanging up, added something in a different tone. If you are asking about the winter of '94, don't go after dark. Why? Another pause, then, because he stopped speaking of that search after one particular morning. And when old men stop talking, it is usually because something frightened them more than death. Klaus drove out just after sunrise. The road south carried him through low cloud and narrow strips of pale light falling across wet meadows. The Alps were visible only in fragments at first. One ridge emerging, then vanishing again behind shifting mist. Villages appeared and passed in the usual order of stone walls, steep roofs, shuttered windows, small chapels, woodpiles stacked with devotional precision. The land looked harmless. That, too, made things worse. Sepp Brandner's house sat at the end of a gravel lane bordered by larch and old fencing wire. The place had once been handsome in a severe rural way. Now the gutters sagged, and 2 shutters hung crooked over a front window filmed with interior dust. Yet the path had been swept. Wood had been cut and stacked recently. Someone still cared about the mechanics of living there. Sepp opened the door before Klaus knocked a second time. Age had reduced him, but not softened him. He stood thin inside a heavy cardigan, his face a weather map of broken capillaries and old altitude. His white hair was cropped close, his breathing shallow. One hand remained hidden in the pocket of his trousers, as if ready to close around something defensive. When he recognized Klaus, he did not invite him in. "You took your time," he said. The sentence moved through Klaus like a draft under a door. "You knew I'd come." Sepp gave a humorless twitch of the mouth. "I knew someone would, once the ice started opening." He stepped aside at last. Inside, the house smelled of smoke, wool, and the medicinal bitterness of old age. A radio muttered from another room, but too quietly to follow. Above the table hung a crucifix darkened by decades of kitchen grease. The windows were small. The light inside seemed permanently reduced, as if the house had been built to keep weather out at the cost of air itself. Sepp lowered himself into a chair and indicated another without warmth. "You brought papers," he said. Klaus set the folder down. "I brought photographs." At that, the old man's eyes shifted, not surprise, recognition. That was when Klaus understood two things at once. Sepp had expected evidence, and whatever he had expected looked enough like these photographs to frighten him before he saw them. Klaus laid out the least revealing image first, the hikers by the stream. Sepp looked, then looked away. His jaw tightened once. "Where did you get that?" "I was sent the prints." "By whom?" "I don't know." "Then you know less than you think." Klaus put down the second image, then the one with Karin crouched by the plants. Sepp's breathing changed. It caught in the upper chest, faint but undeniable. "You saw something in 1994, Klaus said quietly. "No. You told us to search below the eastern moraine line. Many things were said in a storm. You used the words old ground memory." Sepp's face hardened. "And you mocked them." Klaus did not answer. There was no defense worth making. For a while only the radio filled the room, murmuring a news bulletin from somewhere far away. At last, Sepp leaned forward and pressed two fingers flat against the edge of the photograph, not quite touching the image itself. "There are places in these mountains that do not stay where they belong," he said. Klaus almost objected. The sentence was exactly the kind of thing he had spent a career resisting. But he stopped himself. He had not come for agreement. He had come for whatever the old man had carried for 30 years in silence. Sepp continued in a lower voice. "In winter, if the wind runs wrong above the eastern ice, sound changes. Direction changes. A valley that should throw echo east throws it south. Snow drifts into patterns that belong to open ground, not broken slopes. My father knew it. His father too. They called it dead air country. Not a place, a condition. It came and went. Most of the time it meant nothing." He looked at the hikers in the print. "Sometimes it did." Klaus said, "You believed they dropped below the line. I believed they found something." "What?" The old man gave a brittle laugh without humor. "If I knew what, I would have gone rich to the papers. No, I only knew this. On the second morning, before the wind closed again, I went farther east than your teams. There were no bodies, no gear, no slide marks, but I found meltwater where no melt should have been. Warm stones. In February." Klaus felt his own posture change, inch by inch, into a tension he had not allowed himself since retirement. Warm from sun exposure. It was overcast. Geothermal. Not there. What else? Sepp looked toward the window, though there was nothing to see beyond damp branches. "Birdsong." Klaus said nothing. "In the storm," Sepp went on, "not much, just enough to make me think I had gone mad." Then it stopped. "After that, I found one of their route markers tied to a low branch that should not have existed above the ice. Green wood, fresh. I cut a piece and brought it home." "Where is it?" Sepp was silent. Klaus understood before the old man spoke. "They came for it," Sepp said. "Not police, not military either, at least not official. 3 men, civil jackets, good boots, asking in very quiet voices whether I had removed any plant material from restricted hydrological terrain." Hydrological? Imagine. In '94, one of them called me Herr Brandner like a clerk. The other looked around my kitchen as though measuring it for a coffin. "And you gave it to them?" "I burned it before they arrived." "Why didn't you put this in a statement?" Sepp's eyes rose sharply. "To whom?" "To men already deciding what the mountain was allowed to contain." The question sat between them like another person. Klaus looked down at the photograph again. The impossible leaves. The hikers turning towards something beyond the frame. The whole careful falsehood of the accepted story beginning to show its cracks. "Did anyone else know?" he asked. Sepp hesitated, then he nodded once. Lena Eberl. The name meant nothing to Klaus. "She was a survey student then," Sepp said. "Volunteered with supply runs. Bright girl, too curious. She asked to see my notes because she'd noticed the same distortion on a contour overlay from an old forestry archive. Said there was a basin that appeared on one pre-war sheet, then vanished from every later edition." Klaus felt the room tighten. "What happened to her?" Sepp looked at him with visible reluctance, as though the answer itself carried contamination. "She stopped searching. Why? I asked her that once, years later in Berchtesgaden Market. She pretended not to know me. Wouldn't meet my eyes. Her husband answered instead. Said she had been unwell." "What kind of unwell?" Sepp's hand finally came out of his pocket. It was trembling. "Memory," he said. "Not all of it. Only pieces. Names, routes, whole afternoons. She kept notebooks because mornings vanished on her. She used to know every trail line from here to Ramsau. Then one day, she forgot the path to her own sister's house. Neither man spoke for several seconds. The radio muttered on. Somewhere deeper in the house, a pipe knocked once. Outside, a vehicle passed on the road and was gone. Klaus thought of the files, the watcher on the train, the misaligned map, the strange stamp from a geological firm, the warm stones in February. The cut branch burned before inspectors arrived, and a vanished basin that had once appeared on a pre-war sheet. Someone else had noticed the same thing, and someone had stopped them. Sepp reached into the drawer beside him and produced a folded envelope, yellow with age and creased at the edges. "I kept one thing," he said. Inside was a photocopy, so faded it was almost ghostly. A fragment of an old map, hand-labeled in German script, no longer used in modern cartography. Across the lower margin, in pencil not his own, someone had written a single word. Tal, valley. The contour lines around the marked space did not close properly. They bent inward, then broke off as if the surveyor had changed his mind halfway through drawing the land. Klaus looked up. "When did Lena give you this?" Sepp's expression shifted into something like dread. "She didn't," he said. "It was in my letterbox the morning after she disappeared." The photocopy smelled faintly of mildew and coal dust, as if it had spent years in a cellar before someone decided it should move again. Klaus held it under the weak kitchen lamp in Sepp Brandner's house and watched the broken contour lines resist interpretation. The fragment was no larger than a folded church bulletin. One edge had been torn rather than cut. A pre-war forestry stamp, nearly erased by age and bad copying, hovered in the upper corner like a bruise. Most of the markings were too faint to trust, yet the distortion at the center of the sheet was clear enough to unsettle him. The contours should have closed around elevation. Instead, they bent inward, faltered, and simply stopped. The penciled word beneath them, Tal, had not been written by Sepp. That much was obvious. The hand was smaller, more disciplined, the question mark sharp and narrow, as if the writer had been trying not to commit fully to what she suspected. Lena Ebel, a survey student in 1994, a volunteer supply runner. Too curious, Sepp had said. Then gone. Klaus looked up from the photocopy. "What do you mean, disappeared?" Sepp sat with both hands wrapped around a mug he had not touched. His knuckles were swollen, the skin thin enough for the veins to show blue beneath it. "I mean exactly that. She was there for a while, then she wasn't. That is not an answer. It is the only kind people got." The old man's breathing had roughened. Speaking was tiring him, but not enough to make him stop. Klaus had seen that pattern before, in witnesses who had carried a thing too long. Exhaustion and relief often arrived together. "She came out here 3 times in the spring after the search," Sepp said. "Brought copies from archives, old forestry sheets, drainage plans, survey references. Said there was a depression east of the ice that kept appearing and disappearing depending on which year the maps were drawn. Not one clean valley, more like a space nobody could agree how to describe. Natural error?" Sepp gave him a look that contained 30 years of irritation. "Surveyors make errors. They do not all make the same strange one in different decades." Klaus placed the map fragment carefully on the table. "Did she tell anyone official?" "She told one lecturer in Munich, I think. He advised caution, which usually means silence if the subject is inconvenient. Then 2 men came asking after her at the forestry office in Berchtesgaden." "The same men who came to you?" "No. Better dressed." Klaus waited. "She vanished in June. Family said she took work in Switzerland, then Austria, then nowhere. The story moved every time it was told." "And you believed?" Sepp looked down into the dark surface of his coffee. "I believed she got frightened. Later I believed something else." "What?" The old man did not answer immediately. When he did, it was in a quieter voice than before. That she found a door and understood it was not meant to be opened. The sentence should have sounded theatrical. In Sepp's kitchen, under the weak bulb and the ticking radio, it did not. It sounded like rural language, forced to describe a thing it had never been given the right vocabulary for. Klaus slipped the photocopy into his folder. Do you know where her notes went? Sepp shook his head. If they still exist, they are not where honest records live. The drive back from Engadé took longer than it should have because Klaus kept pulling over at overlooks and laybys to study the map fragment against his older survey sheet. Clouds dragged low across the Bavarian Alps, smearing the peaks into pale moving walls. Below them, Berchtesgaden lay in its basin of church towers, hotel facades, bus routes, timber balconies and tourist signs polished into friendliness by generations of visitors. Nothing in the town's neatness admitted the possibility of an erased valley, and yet the fragment in his folder changed the proportions of everything. A missing contour was one thing on paper, and another thing entirely when placed against rock. By the time he reached his house, the afternoon had dimmed into a wet, colourless evening. He locked the door behind him, checked the study window, and carried the folder straight to the table without taking off his coat. He did not trust delay anymore. Delay had shaped too much of his life already. He laid out 3 documents side by side: the 1994 topographic sheet from the rescue file, a modern relief print of the eastern glacial sectors, and Lena Eberl's photocopied fragment. Then he weighted the corners with mugs and a brass compass from his old field kit. The alignment took nearly an hour. The pre-war fragment lacked a scale bar, its edges were incomplete. The projection was older, the symbols inconsistent with contemporary survey standards. But once Klaus anchored 2 streamlines and a shoulder of ridge that had remained stable across all versions, the broken contours of the mystery space began to sit in a very particular relation to the present-day ice. Not east of the glacier, under it. He sat back slowly. The mapped depression, if that was what it had once been, had not vanished in any supernatural sense. It had been buried, masked, or absorbed into later terrain definitions as glacial advance, and official cartography simplified the area into inaccessible ice fields. That alone might have explained the old discrepancy. Landscapes changed, glaciers moved, survey methods improved, but the photographs did not show a buried depression. They showed open ground, warm light, temperate vegetation, and some kind of structure hidden in the background. So either the old basin had once existed and later been occupied, enclosed or engineered, or the map fragment was only the first layer of a much stranger history. He rose and unlocked the last drawer in the metal cabinet, the one he almost never opened. Inside were personal notes, not official records, the things he had never submitted because they belonged to intuition, shame or anger rather than procedure. On top lay the sealed envelope he had avoided for decades. He stared at it for a long moment, then broke the flap. The notes inside had been written in the week after the search was called off. His handwriting then was hard and compressed, every line pressed too deeply into the paper. Some entries were weather summaries and operational regrets. Others were more dangerous because they recorded uncertainty without the protective language of reports. Page 3 contained a detail he had forgotten entirely. Interview, volunteer porter, 16th Feb 1994. Claims one climber from missing group asked whether the lower bowl was still warm in winter. Assumed joke folklore reference. No action taken. Klaus read the line twice, then again. Still warm, not warm by freak geology, warm by reputation. Someone in the expedition had not stumbled into impossible terrain by accident. Someone had heard a story before the storm and taken it seriously enough to ask for confirmation. He turned to the next page. Additional remark from same porter. Group mentioned Old Service Road and Green Place below the line. Possibly confusion with hunting tracks. Dismissed, dismissed. The words seemed to rise from the paper and accuse him directly. He had dismissed it because operations were collapsing, because weather was killing the useful search window, because too many men with too little rest were depending on him to decide what mattered. That explanation had kept him alive with himself for years. Now it felt smaller. The telephone rang at 19 minutes past 6. Klaus froze, then answered on the second ring. A woman's voice, strained and breathless, spoke before he could say hello. "You were with Hannah Seidel yesterday." Not a question. "Who is this?" Klaus asked. "She told me you had the Glacier photographs." He said nothing. "My name is Miriam Voss. I found the camera." The room seemed to sharpen around him. "Where are you?" "That does not matter. It matters if you expect me to trust you." A short silence. Then, You should trust the part of this conversation where I tell you you're being watched." Klaus moved automatically to the window and pulled the curtain aside with 2 fingers. The street lay wet and nearly empty beneath the fading light. No parked car he recognized, no visible figure. "What did you send me?" he asked. "The prints I could get out before site control changed." Site control? The Glacier recovery zone was under regional environmental supervision for 11 hours. Then a private firm arrived with federal clearance language and enough armed contractors to make the local police cooperative. "Karpaten Geologische System," the woman inhaled sharply. "So you've seen the transfer mark?" "Yes." "Then listen carefully. The camera was not the only thing recovered." Klaus closed his eyes for a second, steadying the rush of possibilities. "What else?" "A metal case, partially exposed in meltwater beneath a shelf cavity. It was removed before cataloguing. No one put it in the public log." "What kind of case?" "I only saw it for a few seconds. Olive paint, industrial latches, mid-century construction, maybe older military or research equipment." "And inside?" "I don't know. I wasn't allowed near it after that." He heard movement on her end. Perhaps traffic, perhaps footsteps, perhaps only wind across a microphone. When she spoke again, her voice had lowered. "There was pollen in the camera case seam, bright yellow. I ran an informal comparison before they locked the lab access. The morphology didn't match modern alpine species. It resembled preserved pollen records from late Pleistocene or early Holocene samples." Klaus leaned one hand against the wall. "You are telling me the photographs show plants that should not exist, and the case carried pollen from an extinct ecological profile. I am telling you that if the preliminary comparison was not contaminated, then whatever the film recorded was interacting with a botanical environment no one should be able to walk through in the Bavarian Alps." "And you fled the country?" Another silence, this one thinner. "I left Munich," she said. "That is enough detail." "Why send the photographs to me?" "Because your name appeared in the original incident binder as the search coordinator who closed the field operation, and because one older technician remembered that you never accepted the official version emotionally, even when you signed it professionally." The sentence landed harder than he expected. He said, "You think guilt makes me useful? I think guilt makes people persistent." It was an honest answer. That almost counted as trust. "Did you keep anything else?" he asked. "Yes, one frame the others didn't notice because it was at the end of the damaged strip." His grip tightened on the receiver. "What frame?" "Not of the hikers, of a sign." The word hung between them with a strange flatness. "A sign?" "German text, industrial lettering, partially obscured. I only saw it once before the negative was taken from me, but I copied the visible letters." "Read them." Paper rustled on her end. "Bio, Sphera, Versuchs, Zone." The rest was torn or overexposed. Klaus said nothing. Biosphere experimental zone. Not folklore, not a secret valley in the mystical sense. Something made, built, managed, hidden. Miriam continued before he could respond. "There's more. One of the technicians who processed the material told me the confiscated site archives included local topographical records dating back to the 1940s. Entire shelves removed, not copied. Removed." "The regional archive?" "Yes, Berchtesgaden District Annex, closed this morning for flood remediation." Klaus looked at the map fragment on his table and understood the pattern all at once. The geological firm had not merely taken possession of the current find site, it was stripping history around it. Maps, records, anything that might prove the impossible valley had once left traces in public documents. "What do you want from me?" he asked. "I want you to decide whether this was an accident of history or a continuation." "Continuation of what?" "Of a buried project." The line crackled. He thought for a moment she had disconnected, but then she spoke one final time. "If you go to the archives, don't ask for Lena Ebel by name first. Ask for municipal drainage revisions between 1948 and 1956. That is where the missing basin was first disguised." Then the call ended. Klaus remained motionless for several seconds, receiver still in hand. Outside, a car rolled slowly past the house, tires whispering on the wet road. It did not stop, yet his body responded as if it had. He replaced the handset, then looked again at the materials on the table. Sepp's fading fragment, his own old notes about a green place below the line, Miriam's warning about extinct pollen, and now the copied words from a hidden frame, Biosphere Experimental Zone. A hidden record, a damaged file, an old testimony he had once dismissed. And beneath them all, the possibility that the mountain had not swallowed 4 hikers into nature at all. It had swallowed them into something built by men. He was still staring at the map when he noticed what did not belong. Near the lower margin of the photocopied fragment, just outside the broken contour lines, a faint pencil mark curved upward beside an abbreviated notation he had overlooked in Sepp's kitchen. Under magnification, it resolved into 2 letters and a number, L17. Not a survey symbol, a designation. And beneath it, almost erased by the copier's weak contrast, the outline of what looked very much like a road leading into the center of the buried basin. The district archive in Berchtesgaden occupied a modest post-war building that had never looked important enough to hide anything worth stealing. Its facade was functional, pale and slightly damp around the lower stonework, with narrow windows set too high for casual curiosity. On ordinary mornings, retired genealogists and local historians passed through its doors carrying notebooks, umbrellas, and the patient expressions of people who expected nothing dramatic from paper. That Thursday, a yellow municipal barrier stood across the front entrance. Flood remediation, said the laminated sign. The pavement was dry. Klaus remained in the car for a moment, engine off, hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. The sky above Berchtesgaden had that washed, high-altitude brightness that looked clean from a distance and cruel at close range. The mountains beyond the town were sharply cut by the morning sun. Every ridgeline stood visible. Every surface gave the illusion of perfect honesty. He stepped out and crossed the street without hurrying. The barrier had been placed with bureaucratic neatness, as though whoever arranged it understood that the appearance of procedure could do more work than force. Through the glass, he could see the dim lobby, the coat stand, the closed reading room door, and beyond that, a flicker of movement. Someone was inside. He tried the handle. Locked. A woman at the bakery across the street was watching him while pretending to arrange pastries in the display. Klaus took out his phone, opened the camera, and crouched slightly as if checking a message. In the reflection of the archive glass, he saw a man emerge from the interior corridor. Mid-30s, suit without tie, short hair, posture too alert for clerical work. The man approached the door, stopped 2 meters back, and spoke through the glass without opening it. Building access is suspended. Klaus straightened. Since when does flood damage require private security? The man's expression did not change. Municipal contractors are inside. You're not municipal. I can provide a contact number for records inquiries. Klaus held his gaze. I'm not making an inquiry. I'm confirming whether historic drainage revisions are being removed from public custody. For the first time, something shifted behind the man's eyes, not surprise, calculation, then the expression closed again. If you have concerns, he said, submit them in writing. He turned and walked back into the dim corridor. Klaus stood another 10 seconds, long enough to make a point and not long enough to look rattled. Then he crossed back to the car and drove away without checking the mirror until he had turned twice through narrow residential streets. He was halfway out of town when the first clear wave of anger hit him. Not the hot anger of insult, something older and heavier, the anger of recognizing a pattern one had once helped enable without meaning to. In 1994, he had believed information moved upward in good faith. He had filed notes, signed summaries, deferred to weather, logistics, and institutional sequence. Now he was looking at the same machinery from the outside, and it appeared not as order, but as filtration. A thing happened in the mountain, and layers of procedure gathered around it until only a harmless story remained. By midday, he had called 4 former colleagues. 3 did not answer. The 4th, a retired helicopter pilot named Martin Fellner, answered on the 6th ring with the distracted voice of a man interrupted in the middle of forgetting something. Klaus. Yes, I need 10 minutes. About what? The 94 search. There was a pause. Which search? Klaus closed his eyes briefly. Watzmann, February, Ebner, Vogel, Hartner, Seifert. Another pause, longer this time. Then Martin laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. I don't know why that name feels familiar. The words moved through Klaus with a strange physical chill. You flew the second-day sweep over the eastern sectors. No, I flew mostly avalanche response back then. You flew both. Did I? The uncertainty was real. Klaus heard it, hated it, and believed it at once. Martin had once been a man of exact recall. Wind direction, visibility windows, fuel margins, the placement of a broken body on shale after 7 years, those things stayed in him with almost pathological clarity. For him to lose an entire named search was not ordinary aging. What do you remember about the eastern ice? Klaus asked. A faint sound, perhaps Martin rubbing a hand over his face. Cold. That's all? No, wait. The line crackled. A door closed on Martin's end. Then his voice returned, lower. There was a briefing after. In a room with no windows. Not police, not military exactly. Men with folders. They asked whether anyone had seen artificial geometry below the storm line. Klaus gripped the phone tighter. What did you tell them? I told them no. Was that true? Martin inhaled sharply, then exhaled as if the act itself cost him effort. I don't know anymore. Martin, I'm serious. There are pieces missing. I know because I can feel where they should be. The sentence left Klaus staring at the far wall of his study. Pieces missing, not merely forgotten, but absent in a shape the mind could sense. Who were the men in the room? I don't know. Did you sign anything? I must have. Do you still have it? Martin stopped. For several seconds there was only breathing on the line. Then, in a voice that had gone suddenly tight with fear, he said, Someone was in my garage yesterday. Klaus stood up. What? Nothing stolen. Tools moved. Maps from old flight routes laid out on the workbench. Easting numbers circled in blue marker. I thought it was neighborhood boys until you called. Did you report it? To whom? The old answer again. The answer that kept surfacing whenever ordinary systems had already been entered by something else. Klaus told him not to touch anything, then nearly laughed at himself for the absurdity. If whoever was doing this wanted a garage searched, it had already been searched. If they wanted Martin frightened, that had been accomplished too. After the call ended, Klaus sat for a long time without moving. Pressure had begun to rise in 3 directions at once. Institutions closing, witnesses fragmenting, and old colleagues discovering signs of intrusion so precise they looked less like threats than demonstrations. By afternoon, the pressure found its way into the last place he had hoped to keep separate from the mountain. His daughter called. Anna rarely phoned during working hours. She was 40, a physiotherapist in Traunstein, efficient with love in the way many adult children were with men like Klaus, affection moderated by long familiarity with silence. Their relationship had improved in the years after his wife's death, but improvement was not the same as ease. Are you home? She asked. No, a pause. Then where are you? Out, he heard her exhale slowly. Dad. What? I had a man at the clinic reception this morning asking whether you had any history of confusion. Klaus said nothing. He said he was following up on a municipal welfare inquiry. He had no badge. He knew my name. He knew my mother died in 2015. He asked whether you had ever become fixated on old cases. The room seemed to narrow by a fraction. What did you tell him? That he should leave before I called the police. Her voice sharpened. What are you doing? Nothing that concerns you. That is not remotely true anymore. Klaus crossed to the window. Outside, a delivery van paused at the curb, then moved on. Everything now seemed capable of carrying an extra meaning. Did he give a name? He asked. No, dark coat, brown folder, too polite. Too polite. That matched everything. Anna continued, lower now. This is about the mountain, isn't it? He did not answer fast enough. It is, she said. I knew it the moment he said old cases. You're doing it again. Doing it again meant disappearing inward. It meant the years after 1994, when Klaus had still been physically present at family tables, but mentally absent, lost inside weather notes and route diagrams and the one decision he could never put down. Anna had been young then, old enough to remember the coldness that entered a house when grief took the shape of obsession. "This is different," he said. "That's what you always think." She was angry now, but beneath the anger he heard what mattered more, fear. Not of what he was finding, but of what searching would do to him. "I need you to listen to me," she said. "If someone is asking around about your mental state, it means you are already on someone's radar. Stop before they make you look unstable." The sentence hit with humiliating force because it was sensible. More than sensible, strategic. If the goal was not merely to block him, but to discredit him, then the approach to Anna's clinic was almost elegant. Frame the old rescue coordinator as a guilt-ridden retiree sliding into fixation. Let the past explain away the present. "I can't stop now," Klaus said. "Why not?" Because he had been living beside one closed door for 30 years, and now another had opened behind it. Because 4 people might not have died in a storm at all. Because somebody was still protecting the lie. Because guilt, once given purpose, became difficult to set down. But he said none of that. Instead, because it has already reached you. Silence. When Anna spoke again, her voice was quieter. "Then tell me the truth." He looked at the photographs on the desk, at the copied sign fragment Miriam had recited, at Lena Eberl's broken contours, at the list of names now circled in his own hand. He wanted to protect Anna from it. He also knew, with a cold clarity, that protection had become a costume someone else was already wearing. So he told her part of it, not everything. Not the full shape of the impossible valley, or the extinct flora, or the hidden archive transfers. Only enough to explain why strangers might now be testing the edges of his life. When he finished, Anna did not speak for several seconds. Then she said, "If half of that is true, you should not be alone." He almost answered with reflexive denial. Instead, he let the sentence sit between them. "I've never been useful to you in that part of your life," she said, "but I can at least keep a record. Times, names, car plates, who calls, who comes by. If they try to build a story around you, we build one first around them." Klaus lowered himself into the chair again. The suggestion was practical, calm, and painfully adult. He realized with a sudden ache that his daughter had learned some of her strength from surviving him. "All right," he said. "All right what?" "All right, keep records." After they hung up, he sat for another minute and let the stillness return in pieces. Then he turned back to the work. By dusk, he had assembled a list of everyone still alive who had been close enough to the 1994 search to notice anomalies. Martin the pilot, Sepp Brandner, one forestry clerk now in a care home near Bad Reichenhall, and a former rescue medic named Petra Lenz. Petra had been among the last on-ground personnel to remain at the base staging area before the weather shut everything down. He had not spoken to her in 7 years. She answered on the first ring. "Klaus, you remember the Ebner search?" He did not phrase it as a question. Petra was silent, then said something that made the room feel instantly colder. "I remember remembering it," she said. "Does that make sense to you?" It did, more than he wanted. "I found my old field notebook yesterday," she continued, pages torn out, cleanly, only from those 3 days. Klaus stood again without realizing he had done so. "Who has access to your house?" "No one." "Then who?" "I don't know." Her voice tightened. "Listen to me. 2 nights ago, I woke up because my hallway light was on. I know I switched it off. The front door was locked. Nothing stolen, but my winter boots were by the door with dried grey dust on the soles. Grey dust. Not mud, not road grit. Something mineral." Petra inhaled shakily. "And there was a note in my kitchen bin, not written to me, torn in half, only 1 line left." "What line?" Klaus already sensed he would hate the answer. Petra read it from memory. "Continue regional memory correction through witness attrition. No external release pending site assessment." For a second, he could not speak. Memory correction. Not loss, not age, not coincidence. Policy, procedure, language designed to make violation sound administrative. "Klaus," Petra said. He forced his voice steady. "Do you still have the note?" "Yes." "Don't tell anyone. I'm coming tonight." When he ended the call, the first thing he did was lock the study door, though he knew doors no longer meant what they once had. The second thing he did was place the photographs back into the case, along with Lena's map fragment and the notes from Hannah and Miriam. The third was harder. He took the framed photograph of his late wife from the shelf and turned it face down. Not out of disrespect, out of shame. Because this was the look she had feared she would one day see in him again. The old narrowing, the return of the mountain into everything, the moment when private life became only a corridor leading back to unfinished terrain. Night had fallen by the time he stepped outside. The air smelled of wet pine and distant stone. Across the road, behind the hedge near the old school wall, a figure stood half inside shadow, not moving, not hiding either, just visible enough to confirm that the watching had become open. Klaus did not call out. He got into the car, locked the doors and started the engine. As the headlights swung across the hedge, the figure was gone. But in the beam, fixed neatly to his gate with a strip of grey archival tape, fluttered a single sheet of paper, a photocopied map fragment. Another one, this one marked in red with the designation L18. The red mark had been drawn with a drafting pencil, not a felt pen or office marker. Klaus noticed that first. Even before he stepped out of the car, even before the engine had fully settled into silence, he saw the line quality in the headlights, sharp, deliberate, pressure-controlled. The photocopied fragment on his gate had not been left by someone improvising a threat in haste. It had been prepared by a person who understood maps well enough to annotate them with care. L18. One designation beyond the notation on Lena Ebel's fragment. The paper lifted and fell against the wood as the night wind moved through the hedge. For a moment it seemed almost trivial, a page caught by weather. Then Klaus saw the lower margin. There, half hidden beneath the tape, was a typed strip cut from some larger document. Sector reclassified after containment failure. He did not read it twice. He tore the page free, folded it once, and put it inside his coat pocket. Then he got back into the car and locked the doors again, with a force that made the mechanism sound fragile. The figure near the school wall did not reappear. He drove south toward Petra Lentz's house through a darkness that felt too structured to be natural. The roads were familiar. Wet lanes, village crossings, the occasional passing truck dragging white glare across the windshield. But every reflective sign now looked like an instrument, every lay-by like a place selected in advance. He kept checking the mirror, not because he was certain he was being followed, but because certainty had become the least useful standard available to him. Petra lived in a narrow house above Bad Reichenhall, on a rise bordered by beaches and old retaining walls. The property had once belonged to her parents. The front garden was clipped with paramedic neatness. A porch light burned above the door. She opened before he knocked. She had changed less than he expected and more than he wanted to admit. In her 50s, she had been all compact efficiency, broad-shouldered, quick-eyed, with the physical authority of someone who had lifted injured bodies in snow and never spoken sentimentally about it. Now she was 64 and thinner, her short hair more silver than blonde, her posture slightly guarded around the left hip. But the eyes were the same, direct, unsparing. "You look awful," she said. "So do you." A brief ghost of her old half-smile appeared. "Good. Then we are speaking honestly." Inside, the house was warm and sharply ordered. Medical textbooks still occupied one shelf in the sitting room. On another stood framed photographs of her grown sons, a camping trip, a dog long dead. Everything suggested a life made stable by repetition and practical choices. Everything also suggested, to Klaus now, a life that someone had entered and lightly rearranged. Petra led him into the kitchen and set a torn slip of paper on the table between them. He recognized institutional language before he finished reading it. Regional memory correction through witness attrition. No external release pending site assessment. The text had been typed in a monospaced administrative font, likely from an older printed memo rather than a modern office printer. The paper stock was heavy, yellowed at the edge. Not recent. "Where exactly did you find it?" he asked. "In the kitchen bin, under onion peels and tea bags, folded into a pocket square. I don't own pocket squares." "Anything else moved?" "My hallway light was on, boots by the door. The field notebook pages were gone." She reached for a cigarette out of habit, then seemed to remember she had quit and set the empty hand back down. "When you called, I pulled everything from the cupboard under the stairs. Gear, old jackets, rescue packs. I wanted to see whether they'd touched anything else. And she looked at him without blinking. My avalanche transceiver from 1994 is switched on. Klaus said nothing. No battery should even be alive in that thing, Petra continued, but when I opened the case, it was active. Intermittent tone, like someone had tested it. Where is it? She brought the device from the hall. The casing was scratched, yellowed with age, but intact. When she placed it on the table, a faint pulse sounded from inside the plastic housing. Not regular enough to be a full operating signal, more like a residual call attempting to repeat itself. Klaus turned the unit over and found the battery compartment slightly ajar. Inside, nestled where the old cells should have been, lay a folded square of thin paper. He drew it out carefully. A coordinate string had been written in blue technical ink, followed by a single time. 4747, 1292, 240. The numbers were incomplete, 2 decimals smudged by pressure or damp. But they were enough to locate a zone rather than a point. Petra watched his face. You know where? Near the eastern ice, he said. Or under it. She sat opposite him and folded her hands tightly together. Then whoever came here wanted you to receive that? Yes. Which means this isn't only intimidation. No, her voice lowered. It's guidance. That was the worst possibility of all, because guidance implied choreography. Someone did not merely want Klaus frightened or discredited, someone wanted him moving along a path. Whether toward truth or toward a controlled trap remained impossible to say. He took the new map fragment from his pocket and laid it beside Lena Erbel's earlier photocopy. Petra leaned forward. The 2 pages had clearly originated from the same base chart, same paper type, same reproduction blur along the upper edge, same older survey style. But where Lena's fragment showed the broken contours around L17, the new sheet extended the line slightly farther inward. There, in a space that should have been empty terrain, faint symbols suggested infrastructure. A narrow service road, a hatch marking, and one handwritten note in red, nearly erased by copying. Vent a sealed HE route to L18 unstable. Petra looked up. Vent? Klaus nodded once, slowly. That is what it says. She was silent for a moment. Then, this doesn't sound like a hidden valley. No, it sounds like a buried site. The word neither of them used was facility, because once spoken, it would drag all the other implications into the room with it. State project, military test, research dome, biosphere chamber, underground installation. Klaus had spent enough years around emergency coordination and land management to know how certain kinds of infrastructure vanished from public speech long before they vanished from terrain. Petra rose, crossed to the counter, and poured schnapps into 2 small glasses without asking whether he wanted one. He took it. The liquor burned cleanly and disappeared. When I said I remember remembering, she said, returning to the table, I wasn't being poetic. Klaus waited. The first winter after the search, I could still see pieces of it clearly. The staging tents, Martin shouting over the wind, a volunteer crying in the equipment van because he'd found a glove and thought it meant a body nearby. Then a few years later, parts began to go thin. Not all at once, just odd blanks. What kind of blanks? She stared at the transceiver on the table as if it might answer for her. A briefing room I knew I had stood in, but could no longer picture. A man with a scar at the temple whose face I could describe in everything except feature. A smell of hot metal during a snowstorm, which made no sense, so I assumed I had invented it. Then I stopped trusting my own recall and left it alone. Klaus felt an answering pressure behind his eyes. Martin said something similar. Petra looked up sharply. You spoke to him? Yes. And? He remembers a room with no windows. Men asking whether anyone saw artificial geometry below the storm line. Petra's expression changed, very slightly, into recognition followed by anger. Yes, she said. Yes, that happened. I know it happened because now that you say it, I can hear one of them asking whether reflection off curved surfaces might cause misreporting in wind-driven visibility. Curved surfaces, not rock, not snow. Surfaces. Klaus wrote the phrase down at once. Petra gave a humorless laugh. Look at us. 2 old field people trying to assemble memory like a broken radio. It is still assembly, or suggestion. That too. She studied him for a moment, then asked the question he had been avoiding since he arrived. Why are you really doing this? He could have answered with duty, with truth, with the names of the 4 missing climbers. All of those would have been partially honest, but Petra had known him too long to accept ceremonial motives. So he said, because if I called off the search before they were dead, then I have spent 30 years mourning the wrong failure. Petra's face did not soften. It only grew still. And if you find out they lived longer, she said, then I live with that. And if you find out they walked into it willingly? The question struck harder. Klaus looked down at the photographs laid beside the map fragments. Matthias in the red shell jacket. Karin kneeling beside leaves that belonged to another age. 4 climbers not terrified, not yet, curious, alert, moving forward. I don't know, he said. Petra nodded once, accepting that as the closest available truth. She disappeared into the hall and returned with a battered metal cash box. Inside were remnants from another life. Old rescue tags, batteries, folded route cards, photographs, and a small cassette recorder with cracked black plastic. I found this after your call, she said. I thought it was blank. It wasn't. She pressed play. For several seconds there was only static and the scrape of handling noise. Then a voice emerged, faint but recognizable after a beat. Younger. Breathless. Male. Martin. Repeat, lower sector visual anomaly at East Line. No, not snow movement. Looks like structure, maybe canvas. No, curved, metallic. Can't hold position. The tape crackled violently. Wind roared across the microphone. Another voice cut in. Petra's, younger too, sharper, asking him to repeat. Martin came back once more, words shredded by interference, opening below ridge, green. I said green, Jesus. Then a second male voice, close to the recorder and entirely unfamiliar, speaking in calm German. Recording ends here. A click. Silence. Petra stared at the machine as if it had insulted her personally. I don't remember ever making that recording. Klaus's own heartbeat had become suddenly and annoyingly audible. Nor do I remember Martin saying green, she added. But he did. Yes. He rewound and played the last seconds again. The final voice was not wind-frayed or distant. It was near the device. Controlled, educated, not rescue personnel, not local dialect. Someone who had intervened physically at the recorder. Petra looked at him. This is no longer just old paper. No. It's entry. The word settled into the room with precise weight. Entry. Not theory, not grief, not memory alone. A route, a time, event designation. Evidence that the missing space inside the mountain had infrastructure, and that at least one pilot had seen enough of it in 1994 to speak the word green before someone cut the record. Petra rose again, this time with decision rather than nerves. Then I'm coming with you. Klaus shook his head immediately. No, don't do that. What? That old command voice, as if I'm still on your field roster. Her tone sharpened. I'm not 28 and waiting for you to sign my route card. This crosses into my memory, my house, my records. If someone has been adjusting our lives for 30 years, I get a vote. He knew she was right. He also knew companionship changed risk into responsibility. Petra, I still know snowpack. I still know emergency medicine. And unlike you, I won't romanticize dying on a mountainside because guilt has made you stupid. The sentence landed with brutal accuracy. He let out a slow breath. You think that's what I'm doing? I think guilt is making you brave in the wrong directions. No one else could have said it to him and remained in the room. He nodded once. All right. The plan formed between them quickly after that, with the clean economy of people who had once worked under weather clocks. They would not go to the coordinates at 0240, not yet. First, they would verify the location against current terrain data and older forestry access lines. Petra would copy the cassette and leave one version with her sister in Salzburg under sealed instructions. Klaus would prepare 2 map sets, one public and one derived from the fragments. They would tell Anna enough to establish a record without revealing the full route. As Petra gathered supplies, Klaus stood alone for a moment near the kitchen window. Outside, the beech trees moved restlessly in the night wind. Their branches brushed the dark glass with a dry, skeletal sound. In the reflection, he saw himself older than he felt, coat still on, shoulders set in that old forward angle. The face of a man who had spent too many years preparing to meet a past that might not want him. Then he saw something else in the reflection, not inside the kitchen, beyond it. At the edge of Petra's garden, near the low stone wall, a figure stood perfectly still in the dark. No movement, no cigarette glow, no phone screen, just a person-shaped absence where no one should have been. Klaus turned at once and looked directly through the glass. The figure was gone. He stepped outside with a flashlight and crossed the damp grass to the wall. Petra followed a moment later, swearing under her breath. The beam moved over wet leaves, old stone, churned soil, and finally a patch of flattened moss where someone had stood long enough to leave a clean oval depression. In the center of it lay a single object, a modern military uniform patch, no nation marking, no unit name, only a geometric insignia in dark thread, a circle enclosing two offset shadows. By dawn, the patch lay on Klaus's kitchen table beneath a reading lamp and looked no less unsettling for having dried. It was machine-stitched, recent, and made of the kind of dense matte fabric used in field uniforms designed not to reflect light. The insignia at its center was simple enough to be forgettable in another context. A circle enclosing two offset shadow lines, but once seen beside the final photograph from the Glacier, the one where the hikers stood beneath two conflicting light sources, the design ceased to feel decorative. It looked referential, intentional. Petra sat opposite him with a magnifier in one hand and a cup of coffee gone cold in the other. Neither of them had slept. The cassette recorder, Lena Eberl's map fragment, the newer L18 sheet, the coordinates hidden inside Petra's old avalanche transceiver, and the military patch formed a loose ring across the table like evidence in a room no court would ever authorize. Outside, the first light spread over the lower valley in a flat silver wash. Church bells sounded from somewhere below, thin and distant in the morning air. The world was beginning another ordinary day. Inside the house, ordinary time had started to fail. "I know what I thought this was," Petra said at last. Klaus looked up. "I thought maybe there was a buried research site. Cold War, botanical, geological, something ugly but comprehensible. Hidden from the public, protected later because no institution likes old secrets." She set down the magnifier. "Now I think that explanation is too small." Klaus said nothing. He had been moving toward the same conclusion with growing reluctance. A buried facility still made sense of the old sign fragment Miriam Voss had copied. Biosphere Experimental Zone. It made sense of the vents, the service road notation, the erased archive material, the men in clean jackets asking witnesses about artificial geometry in a snowstorm. But it did not fully explain the photographs. Not the light, not the flora, not the unnerving absence of panic in the hikers' faces, and certainly not the modern patch left deliberately in Petra's garden. He drew the last photograph closer and studied it again. Matthias slightly ahead. Karin turned 3/4 towards something outside frame. Daniel's posture more relaxed than it had any right to be if they were merely lost in bad terrain. Their shadows falling in one direction, then another, the image had originally suggested impossible sunlight. Now, after the patch, Klaus saw something else in it. Not two suns, two systems of illumination, the natural world and something built to rival it. Petra watched his expression change. "You see it differently now." "Yes. How?" "It isn't just a place they entered," he said. "It's an environment." The sentence hung between them. An environment, controlled, maintained, enclosed. The apparent explanation he had been clinging to, that the four mountaineers had somehow stumbled into a forgotten facility hidden beneath glacial terrain, now seemed incomplete in a deeper way. It assumed the hidden thing was static, dead, archaeological, a sealed biosphere, an abandoned experiment, a piece of buried history. But the modern patch meant continued presence. The subtle searches of houses meant active protection. The memory attrition language on Petra's torn note suggested not mere secrecy, but management. This was not only a ruin being rediscovered. Something about it had continued beyond the end of its supposed era, and that collapsed Klaus's original belief more violently than he cared to admit. For several days, he had been treating the mystery as an old wound reopening. 1994, reaching into the present through meltwater and paper trails. But now the direction reversed. The present had been inside the wound all along. Whatever existed under the eastern ice had not simply swallowed the hikers and vanished. It had kept operating, in some form, through the decades that followed. That realization stripped away the comfort of historical distance. This was no longer a tragedy preserved in frozen time. It was an active system with living custodians. Petra stood, stretched the stiffness from her back, and went to the sideboard where she had left a modern tablet beside Klaus's older printed maps. She touched the screen, enlarging the incomplete coordinate string taken from the transceiver note. "Let's stop thinking like witnesses," she said. "Let's think like entry teams." It was an old sentence from another life, and hearing it from her pulled Klaus briefly backward into the operational calm they had once shared on mountainsides, before fear had time to grow personality. Together, they cross-referenced the partial coordinates with the L-17 and L-18 fragments. Older relief sheets, Martin Fellner's recorded mention of an opening below ridge, and the visible terrain relationships from the photographs. By mid-morning, a likely convergence point began to emerge. Not an exposed basin, but a section of glacially overrun slope above a buried hollow, where a vent line or maintenance shaft might once have surfaced before being masked by later ice movement. The likely access zone lay farther north than Klaus had first assumed, tucked beneath a wind-scoured shoulder rarely visited outside technical winter routes. In summer, with melt conditions increasing, parts of the old cover system might now be approaching exposure. Petra traced the line with one finger. If this is right, the service road didn't go down into a valley from the outside. It went in laterally from a lower approach before the glacier advanced. Klaus nodded. Which means the terrain people thought they were entering in 1994 may not have been external terrain at all. She looked at him. Say that clearly. He did. They may have crossed from natural ground into an artificial landscape without understanding where the boundary was. Petra let the thought settle. A false valley, or a contained one. And the reason the photographs look impossible is because they were taken inside a controlled biosphere designed to resemble open temperate terrain. Klaus glanced at the final image again. Not resemble, function. That was the decisive shift. He could feel it as physically as a weather front moving through the body. The photographs were not showing a decorative simulation or a bizarre scenic experiment. They were showing a working environment with flora, water flow, light systems, and terrain large enough to disorient four experienced mountaineers into believing they had discovered an unmapped valley. The mystery did not belong to folklore or geography anymore. It belonged to architecture on an impossible scale, and to whatever had happened after the hikers entered it. Around noon, Klaus phoned Anna. He gave her the route envelope they had prepared. Departure time, vehicle details, 2 contact names, and a sealed instruction to open the second page only if neither he nor Petra checked in by the following afternoon. He did not tell her everything. He could hear from the first seconds of her breathing that she already knew enough. "You're going anyway," she said. "Yes. And if I tell you not to, I'll go anyway." A long pause. When she spoke again, her voice was steady but thinner than usual. "Then at least admit this to me. You're not doing this only for the dead climbers." Klaus looked at the patch on the table. The 2 offset shadows inside the stitched circle seemed to move slightly under the lamp, though he knew they did not. "No," he said. "For what then?" He answered more honestly than he intended. "To find out whether the last 30 years were built on a lie so large it changed what I remember about my own life." Anna did not respond immediately. Then, "That's a dangerous reason." "Yes. It makes people keep going after they should stop." "I know." Before hanging up, she said something that stayed with him long after the line went dead. "If this place rewrites memory, don't trust conviction as proof. Trust records, trust repeated physical things, and trust Petra before you trust yourself." The advice was painfully sound. By afternoon they were packing, not as climbers in the romantic sense and not as officials. as two older field professionals who knew better than to overburden themselves in unstable terrain. Crampons, rope, probe poles, thermal layers, med kits, spare batteries, GPS, headlamps, a compact camera, food sealed against moisture, emergency bivouac foil, one ice saw, one short-handled entrenching tool, one crowbar that Petra insisted on bringing because old places respect leverage. Klaus added the cassette recorder, Lena's fragment copies, the coordinate note, and the photographs in waterproof sleeves. He left the original military patch behind in a locked tin beneath the sink. At 3 o'clock, Miriam Voss called again from a number that immediately vanished when Petra tried to save it. "I heard from Hannah," she said without greeting. "You've moved from the archive stage to the field stage." "How?" Klaus asked. "Because the district annex is empty now. Not closed, empty. Shelving removed. Box labels stripped. This morning a truck convoy left with no company markings." Petra leaned closer to the speaker. Miriam continued, "One more thing. I recovered a lab note before I left. It refers to the pollen contamination issue. Only it doesn't call it contamination. It calls it legacy biome drift." Klaus frowned. "Meaning?" "It implies the biological material was not an accidental remnant. It implies something self-contained had started bleeding into surrounding melt systems." Petra looked sharply at him. "Self-contained? Bleeding?" Miriam lowered her voice. "If you go up there, do not assume the boundary remains where it used to be." The call ended before either of them could ask more. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then Petra said, "There it is." "What?" "The thing neither of us wanted to say. This may no longer be fully buried." By evening, clouds had begun to gather over the higher ridges, not a full storm, but unstable weather moving in layers. Thin veils of white across blue, light flattening over the mountain, wind beginning to test the trees in irregular pulses. Klaus knew that kind of weather intimately. It did not close the window. It made the window dangerous. They left after dark and drove without radio. The roads into the upper parklands narrowed, then darkened, then narrowed again. Tourist season had not fully peaked, and the late hour kept most traffic away. Only once did another vehicle appear behind them, a dark utility car that held distance through 3 turns before taking a different road near Ramsau. Klaus did not comment on it, and neither did Petra. They parked at an unlit service lay-by below the old eastern approaches and began the climb on foot under headlamps and a sky that kept losing stars behind moving cloud. The first hour was ordinary in the brutal alpine sense. Wet stone, rooted trail, loose moraine, the clean, cold bite of altitude. Klaus's knee complained early, then settled into familiar resentment. Petra moved with less speed than she had 30 years ago, but more caution, which mattered more. They spoke only when necessary. At 0150, they reached the first coordinate window. Nothing. Only wind-stripped rock and old ice crust sagging over melt channels. At 0217, they shifted north and higher based on the L18 fragment's vent notation. Still nothing obvious. Then at 0236, Klaus stopped so abruptly Petra nearly walked into him. Ahead, half masked by blown snow and a spill of rockfall, stood a line that did not belong to the mountain. Not visible all at once, more sensed than seen at first. A curve where no curve should exist, smooth under frost, matte beneath ice dust. A segment of dark material emerging from the slope like the shoulder of something vast buried on its side. Petra whispered the word before he could. Dome. The camouflage surface rose out of the ice at an angle impossible to mistake once recognized. Not natural stone, not avalanche debris, engineered skin built to disappear in terrain and now slowly reappearing as the glacier thinned. Klaus felt the whole architecture of his earlier assumptions give way. There was no secret valley hidden by cartographic error. There was a structure under the mountain, and the valley in the photographs had almost certainly existed inside it. As he stepped closer, his headlamp caught a seam line running beneath rime along the buried curvature. Beside it, nearly obscured by decades of mineral staining, was a stenciled warning in German. Bioclimosphäre 3, Ossenhülle, outer shell. Petra stared at the letters. Then a low mechanical sound rolled through the ice beneath their boots. Not an avalanche. Something waking up below them. The sound beneath the ice did not resemble anything the mountain should have been able to make. It came first as a low pressure through the soles of their boots, a deep mechanical tremor rather than a natural shift. Then it rose into a muted internal resonance, as if some enormous chamber below the glacier had drawn breath after decades of holding it. Snow dust slid in fine streams down the exposed curve of the dome. A seam line, barely visible beneath rime and mineral stain, seemed to tighten and release again. Klaus and Petra stood motionless in the dark, their headlamps cutting narrow cones across a surface that had no right to exist beneath the eastern ice. The mountain had not opened onto a valley, it had opened onto architecture. Petra spoke first, but only just above a whisper. "Tell me that was settling." Klaus did not answer. He knew the acoustics of alpine movement, the groan of glacial stress, the sharp complaint of shifting ice, the dry collapse of wind-loaded slab. This had not been any of them. The sound had contained rhythm, delay, response. The outer shell of the buried dome continued to emerge in fragments around them as their eyes adjusted to the geometry. What had first looked like a single curve now suggested scale beyond immediate comprehension. A broad section of matte black material arced under wind-packed snow, broken by a line of recessed joints and 3 low protrusions that might once have housed vents. One of those protrusions had collapsed inward, exposing a circular collar of metal beneath the camouflage skin. Petra moved her light across it and inhaled sharply. "That's no vent cap," she said. "That's an access ring." Klaus crouched near the exposed section and brushed away frozen granules with a gloved hand. Beneath them lay bolted steel, industrial and thick, stained by long seepage. The bolts had been treated against corrosion. Some had failed, others held, a buried service point, a route in. The thought should have brought relief, or at least a coarse practical focus. Instead, it brought something close to dread. Up here, in darkness, with the wind dragging over the slope and the first unstable weather moving across the upper range, every step toward the dome felt less like investigation and more like trespass into a place that had spent 30 years erasing its own witnesses. Klaus turned off his headlamp for 2 seconds. The darkness that replaced it was not complete. At first, he thought it was moonlight filtered through the cloud. Then he understood. A faint pallor leaked from somewhere lower along the shell, not bright enough to define edges, only enough to suggest depth where there should have been none. A seam, a crack, an opening beneath the ice still feeding a residual glow into the storm dark. He switched the lamp back on. Petra had seen it too. "So," she said very quietly, "it still has power." Klaus stood up too fast, and his knee bit hard. He ignored it. "Or emergency systems." After 30 years, he looked at the stenciled warning again. Bioklimasphäre 3, Außenhülle. Not a research shed, not an observation station, not even a conventional bunker. A biosphere. 3rd iteration, at least by designation. Outer shell, which implied inner shell, climate systems, environmental control, and a scale of construction far beyond any forgotten mountain annex or Cold War curiosity. This had never been a side project. It had been an installation large enough to simulate an ecosystem and hide it under a mountain, and 4 climbers had walked into it in 1994. The realization altered the weight of every previous memory. For years, Klaus had imagined that if the lost expedition were ever found, the truth would be bitter but legible. Exposure, misjudgment, avalanche burial in inaccessible terrain, some version of ordinary alpine cruelty. Even after the photographs surfaced, part of him had still been trying to force the evidence into a shape the world could explain, a hidden hollow, a classified site, an abandoned experiment swallowed by later ice. But this buried outer shell humming faintly beneath their feet, destroyed the last of those compromises. The apparent explanation had not merely been incomplete. It had been arranged to remain incomplete. Petra was already unpacking the short-handled entrenching tool and crowbar. If there's a collar, there may be a maintenance hatch below it. Klaus looked upslope automatically, checking wind direction, snow texture, overhangs. "We do this carefully, no heavy levering until I know what the slab above us is doing." She gave him a brief sidelong glance. "There's the old voice." "I'd rather bring the old voice than die under 6 tons of unstable ice." Fair. For the next 20 minutes, they worked in disciplined silence, using the tools not to force entry, but to clear what the glacier had already loosened. Ice crust broke in plates. Mineral-rich melt deposits came away like rotten plaster. Twice, Klaus stopped them to listen for shifting load above. Twice the slope answered only with wind and the far internal murmur of the structure below. Bit by bit, the collar revealed itself. A circular frame around what had once been a sealed maintenance shaft, now partially crushed and fused by decades of pressure. The opening itself was no longer intact. One side had buckled inward, leaving a narrow triangular breach where the upper ring had warped against something beneath. Petra lowered her headlamp and peered into the gap. Depth about 3 meters to first platform, she said. Metal ladder on the left, rusted but visible. Klaus moved beside her and looked. The shaft swallowed light rather than reflecting it. Frost feathered the inner walls. Below, just as Petra said, a grated platform caught the beam. Beyond that platform, a second darkness opened laterally, suggesting a tunnel or service conduit leading deeper into the dome. And from somewhere beyond the immediate drop came that same dim, diffuse pallor he had seen with his lamp off. Not daylight, system light. Low-power emergency illumination, still breathing in the dark. Petra sat back on her heels. This is where we decide whether we're climbers or witnesses. He knew what she meant. Up to this point, they had been collecting evidence from the edge. Maps, recordings, fragments, traces. Once they went down that shaft, everything changed. The mountain would no longer be the subject of inquiry. It would become an environment acting directly on them. And with that change came the second truth Anna had warned him about. Conviction was not proof. Emotion, guilt, vindication, none of it would protect them from making a final wrong decision. Klaus forced himself to name the risks aloud. Unknown structural stability, unknown air quality, unknown active systems, unknown human presence, Petra nodded. And weather shift above us. Also the possibility we're expected. Yes. That last word lingered longer than the others, because the evidence did not point only toward concealment. It pointed, increasingly, toward invitation. The coordinates in the transceiver. The L-18 fragment taped to Klaus's gate. The patch left in Petra's garden. Guidance, not just warning. A shaped route inward, which meant one of two things. Either someone inside the machinery protecting this place wanted them to find it, or someone wanted them inside for reasons that had nothing to do with truth. Petra read his expression. You're thinking trap. I'm thinking choreography. Same family. Wind passed across the shell in a rising sweep. Loose snow whispered over the exposed curve and vanished into darkness. Klaus looked downslope toward the invisible valleys below and imagined Anna at work, Martin in his garage, Petra's torn notebook, the man at the archive glass, Miriam Voss moving through train stations or borrowed rooms under names that would not hold. The investigation had already crossed into too many lives. There was no longer a clean retreat to ignorance. But there might still be retreat to silence. That was the choice now, and he felt its weight with humiliating clarity. If they stopped here, photographed the dome, marked the coordinates, left the mountain alive, they would possess enough to tell a partial story. Enough to alarm journalists, lawyers, perhaps Parliament if the right documents followed. Enough to force public attention onto the existence of a buried structure under the Watzmann sector, yet not enough to explain the photographs, not enough to account for the missing climbers, not enough to prove whether the valley inside had been abandoned, active or weaponized through secrecy, and not enough to prevent whoever controlled the site from burying the entrance again before daylight. Petra seemed to reach the same conclusion at the same moment. We go down, she said. Klaus did not answer. Instead, he took out the waterproof sleeve containing the photographs and looked one last time at the final frame. The hikers at the edge of the clearing, two sets of shadows, one world intersecting another. For 30 years, he had thought his worst failure was logistical. A search ended too soon, an area left uncovered because weather had stripped away the margin for hope. Now a more painful possibility stood in front of him. What if the true failure had begun earlier, in the way he had understood responsibility itself? He had always believed he failed them by not staying on the mountain long enough. But perhaps he had failed them by trusting the mountain to be the only thing capable of taking them. Petra touched his arm. "Klaus." He looked at her. "This is the point," she said. "If you are doing this to punish yourself, we stop. If you are doing it to learn what happened, we continue." The question entered him like cold water. For a moment he could not answer, because the truth was not clean. Guilt was in everything. It had shaped the route, the sleeplessness, the willingness to climb into dark structures hidden under glacial mass at his age. But there was something else now too. Not redemption. That word belonged to religion and memoirs, not fieldwork. Something harder. Accuracy. He wanted accuracy, however destructive. "To learn," he said. Petra held his gaze a second longer, then nodded. They clipped in. Rope anchored to a buried rock horn above the collar. Secondary line to Petra's harness. Air meter on Klaus's chest strap. Headlamps checked. Radio channels tested, though neither expected ordinary reception below. Klaus took the crowbar, Petra the medkit and recorder. He photographed the opening, the stenciled warning, the seam lines, and the immediate surroundings. Then he sent one scheduled text to Anna, using the last reliable signal they would probably have. Going below, if no message by 1400, open second envelope. The message took too long to send. When the confirmation finally appeared, it felt less like communication than farewell. Klaus descended first. The ladder rungs held, though the top three shifted under his weight. Metal smell rose from the shaft. Not rust alone, but something older and drier, like sealed machinery, waking to damp air after a long sleep. His boots touched the grated platform with a hollow clang that rolled downward into depth too large for a service shaft. He unclipped and turned, sweeping the beam into the lateral passage. The walls were curved composite over steel frame, lined with dead conduits and cracked insulation. Frost had crept along everything in pale veins. Yet below the frost lay another layer, paint. Institutional green-grey, still intact in places. Petra descended behind him, the rope rasping lightly over the collar ring. Once both stood on the platform, Klaus leaned into the tunnel and listened. At first he heard only the low infrastructural pulse they had already felt through the ice. Then something else. A periodic clicking sound, faint, mechanical, and regular. Not collapse, not wind, a relay trying to cycle. They advanced single file through the conduit, shoulders nearly brushing the walls. Condensation beaded on the ceiling and dropped at slow intervals. A narrow emergency strip ran along the floor, dark for several meters, then dimly amber farther in. Somewhere deeper, air was moving. Not much, but enough to make the colder pockets breathe against their faces. At the first junction, Klaus stopped. A metal sign hung askew from one bracket, half obscured by mineral crust. He scraped it gently with the edge of a glove until the lettering showed. Zugang L18, Wartungsschacht B, Access L18, Maintenance Shaft B. Beneath it, in newer stencil, someone had added a second instruction in plain modern German. No personnel entry. Environmental instability. Petra touched the sign without quite meaning to, then withdrew her hand. Newer stencil, she said, much newer. Yes. So someone was still updating warnings long after the original site closed. Klaus did not reply. He had seen something at the base of the sign, a smear across the mineral crust. Dark, matte, not rust. He angled the beam closer. Fabric residue, recent, perhaps torn from clothing while squeezing past the junction. Someone had entered this shaft not decades ago, but recently enough to leave fibers the mountain had not yet digested. Petra was watching him now. We're not alone in the timeline. No. The amber strip along the floor brightened slightly, then dimmed again. And farther down the passage, somewhere beyond two blind turns and a pressure door standing half open, a human voice said in calm German, "You took longer than expected." The voice did not echo the way it should have. It arrived through the maintenance passage with a disturbing clarity, neither raised nor hurried, as if the speaker had been standing only a few meters away, rather than somewhere deeper inside the buried structure. Calm German, educated, no obvious regional accent. Male, perhaps late middle age, though enclosed spaces made age difficult to trust. You took longer than expected. Klaus felt Petra still beside him, not frozen exactly, but converted into the kind of stillness trained people used when every unnecessary movement became a declaration. The amber strip along the floor pulsed once, then steadied into a dim, continuous line that barely touched the lower walls. Somewhere above and behind them, the mountain pressed downward in millions of silent tons, while ahead, the corridor bent right through a half-open pressure door and into a zone the headlamps could not yet claim. Petra angled her light toward the fabric smear at the sign. Not panic. Inventory. Klaus answered the unseen speaker without moving forward. Expected by whom? For a second there was no response. Then the same voice, a little nearer or perhaps only clearer through the conduit. By the system that has been trying to reach a witness for 3 decades. Petra shot him a look. The system. Not we, not I, not my people or my unit or my employer. The phrasing was wrong in a way that made it harder, not softer. Either the speaker was hiding behind abstraction or he meant exactly what he said. Klaus kept his own voice level. Step into the light. A pause, then, not yet. You still assume light clarifies. Something in the tone, not theatrical, not smug, simply tired, disturbed Klaus more than overt menace would have. Men who threatened openly could still be understood as actors within familiar motives. This voice sounded like a man too far inside a structure to remember ordinary conversation. Petra said, "If you wanted us here, start with your name." At that, the unseen speaker almost laughed, though the sound stopped before becoming one. "My name will only distract you. You came for the mountain, the climbers, and the lie around them. Better to begin there." The lie around them. Klaus took one measured step toward the pressure door, crowbar low in his right hand. "We came because 4 people disappeared in 1994. Yes. And because film recovered from the Glacier shows them inside an environment that does not exist on public maps. That is also true. And because houses have been searched, archives emptied, records altered, and witnesses reduced to fragments. This time, the answer came later. Not altered, the voice said, buffered. Klaus felt anger move through him with a clarity that sharpened rather than clouded. You have a remarkable talent for choosing administrative words. Administrative words were the only language that kept this place alive above ground. The amber line on the floor flickered again, then brightened just enough to reveal more of the passage beyond the half-open door. Curved walls, conduit housings, a second corridor running off to the left, and at the far threshold, finally, a figure. Not close enough for full detail, only shape first. Tall, thin, standing in a dark weatherproof coat over clothing too neutral to identify. No visible weapon, grey hair, head slightly inclined, as if studying their reaction rather than preparing to stop them. He stepped half into the spill of their lamps. A man in his late 60s or early 70s, gaunt but upright, with the severe composure of someone who had learned long ago to separate bodily needs from purpose. His face was narrow, almost bloodless in the mixed light, and marked near the left temple by a pale vertical scar. Petra inhaled. Klaus understood a second later. The room with no windows, the scar at the temple. The man memory had failed to keep whole. "You were there after the search," Petra said. The man looked at her, not surprised. Yes. Klaus felt the years fold inward with nauseating speed. "Who are you?" The man placed one hand lightly against the doorframe, as though conserving strength mattered. "Dr. Adrian Voss." The surname struck Klaus a beat late. "Miriam Voss," Petra said. Something flickered across the man's face for the first time. Grief, or the shape grief left after many years of discipline. "My daughter," he said, though she would prefer the word former. The passage seemed to narrow. Miriam, the climate researcher who had mailed the photographs, had not merely stumbled into the recovery of an old secret. She belonged to the bloodline of a man who had once stood inside the machinery protecting it. Pieces began to connect, but in a shape more unstable than before. Klaus said, "Your daughter sent us the prints." "I know." "You let her?" "I failed to stop her. Those are not identical conditions." Petra took one step forward. "You're the one who cut Martin's field recording." Voss did not deny it. "Yes." 30 years compressed into a single syllable. Klaus had imagined many versions of this confrontation over the last days. Secretive executives, security contractors, a buried Cold War cell still obeying extinct orders. He had not imagined an old man in a maintenance corridor answering calmly for memory attrition and vanished maps as if they belonged to a technical debrief. You stood in the room after the search and asked witnesses whether they had seen artificial geometry below the storm line, Klaus said. Yes. You supervised the removal of evidence. In part. You called it buffering. Dr. Voss looked at the floor strip rather than at either of them. You still want a moral language fast enough to carry all of this. It won't. Petra's voice sharpened. Try us. He lifted his gaze again. If the site had been exposed in T4, the climber's disappearance would have become the smallest consequence. The sentence should have sounded evasive. Instead, it landed with the weight of practiced conviction. Klaus knew that tone. He had heard it in ministers after avalanches, in mayors after floods, in military liaison officers standing beside maps that did not yet include the dead. It was the tone of people who had once made a choice under pressure and then spent decades living inside its logic until all alternatives became childish fantasies. What is this place? Klaus asked. Dr. Voss looked past them briefly toward the shaft leading up into the ice, as if measuring time. Originally, a Cold War Alpine biosphere program jointly funded through layers of deniable institutions that no longer exist in the form they would recognize. The official purpose was habitat resilience, closed environment agriculture, atmospheric control, human adaptation. The unofficial purpose changed depending on the decade, the sponsor, and the fear. Civil defense, strategic shelter, psychological endurance modeling. Environmental continuity under catastrophe. His hand remained on the frame, but Klaus saw now that it trembled very slightly. Then the mountain moved faster than the budget models. Access narrowed, funding fragmented, public cover became difficult, components were mothballed, personnel reduced, but Bioclimasphere 3 did not entirely die. Klaus thought of the photographs, the impossible meadow, the broad-leafed plants, the dual shadows. Because the environment inside remained viable. Yes, Dr. Voss said, intermittently, unpredictably. Enough to matter, Petra said, and the climbers. Something changed again in the man's face. Not guilt exactly. A harder thing. Weariness that had outlived excuse. They entered during a boundary failure. The phrase echoed Miriam's warning in Klaus's mind, do not assume the boundary remains where it used to be. What does that mean? Klaus asked. Dr. Voss took a slow breath. It means the site was never meant to interface directly with exterior alpine terrain. But over time, under pressure, thaw cycles, and partial system decay, certain environmental seams became unstable. Microclimatic bleed, light bleed, temperature anomalies, acoustic drift. On rare occasions, under very specific meteorological conditions, the transition zone could present. Petra stared at him. Present? Yes. You're saying a hidden interior environment became reachable from the mountain. I am saying the distinction between interior and exterior was not always behaving. The clinical wording should have made the idea sound absurd. Instead, inside the humming corridor, it made a terrible kind of sense. Warm stones in February, birdsong in a storm, the lower bowl still warm in winter, a green place below the line, a false valley that was not entirely false. Klaus felt the full shape of his original belief collapsing behind his ribs. For 30 years, he had imagined snow, exposure, and terrain as the only forces in play on the day the 4 climbers vanished. Even when the photographs appeared, he had treated the impossible valley as a destination discovered after the storm. Now the truth bending toward him was worse. The storm itself may have been the doorway. Did they know what they were entering? He asked. Dr. Voss's answer came without hesitation. No. Petra was the one who spoke next, and her voice had changed into something more dangerous than anger. Then why were their families told nothing? The old man looked at her for a long moment. Because by the time we understood what had happened, we no longer knew which version of the truth would do less damage. Petra laughed once sharply. So you chose the version that protected you? Yes, he said. The honesty of it hit harder than denial would have. He went on before either of them could interrupt. Also because we did not recover bodies. Silence. Not silence as absence, silence as impact. Klaus heard his own pulse in his ears. Explain. We recovered equipment trails, disturbance patterns, biological contamination, one of their packs, later camera material, but no bodies. You just said they entered. They did. And then, Dr. House, Voss looked past them again, this time not at the shaft, but deeper into the dome, as if the answer was physically located farther inside. We tracked them for 31 hours. The corridor seemed to tilt. 31 hours, not lost in a storm for minutes, not buried at once. 31 hours inside the contained environment beneath the mountain. Klaus pressed one hand against the wall because the alternative was letting his balance show. Alive, yes. The word entered him like a blade turned carefully. Every year since 1994 had been built on the acceptance that the search had ended against death already accomplished or inevitable. 31 hours shattered that foundation completely. It took the decades of managed guilt and stripped them to bone. They were alive, Petra said, almost to herself. Dr. Voss nodded once. Klaus spoke through a throat that no longer felt wholly under his control. And you did not send a rescue team in. The old man closed his eyes, briefly, perhaps the only gesture resembling defeat he had yet allowed himself. We could not stabilize the transition corridor long enough. 2 of our own were lost attempting internal retrieval. You still did not tell the families. No. And you erased witnesses instead. We contained exposure while attempting to prevent a larger breach. Again, the language. Again, the steel-hard bureaucratic casing around moral ruin. Petra took another step. And this time, Klaus had to lift a hand slightly to stop her without touching her. Dr. Voss saw the movement and accepted it as he might have accepted an instrument reading. You came for the shape of the hidden truth, he said. Here it is. The 4 climbers were not victims of the mountain alone. They crossed into a functioning, controlled biome during a weather-induced boundary event. They remained alive long enough to document it. We failed to recover them before the corridor destabilized. After that, the site was sealed, the records stratified, and memory management protocols expanded. The pieces had connected. Not elegantly, not cleanly, but enough to show the terrible architecture underneath everything. The green place, the dome, the vents, the erased maps, the modern patch, the recovered camera, the active protection network. The witnesses stripped not of all memory, but of the dangerous parts. The lie that had shaped Klaus's life was now visible in outline. Yet even in that outline, the most important proof still wavered just beyond reach. No bodies, no final record of what became of the 4 after the 31 hours. No certainty whether they died inside, were moved, or reached some part of the system no one fully controlled. Klaus knew it the moment the realization formed. The shape of the truth was now before him, but the center was still missing. Take us to where they were tracked, he said. Dr. Voss did not answer immediately. Then the old man looked deeper into the dome once more and said, with a fatigue so absolute it sounded almost like surrender, "That is exactly why I brought you here." Dr. Adrian Voss did not lead them at once. For several seconds after he spoke, the 3 of them remained in the maintenance corridor while the buried biosphere murmured around them in pulses of failing infrastructure. Condensation ticked softly from overhead pipes. Somewhere far below, a relay clicked, paused, clicked again. The amber floor strip stretched past the half-open pressure door like a guideline left for personnel who had not walked here in years. "That is exactly why I brought you here." Klaus heard the sentence again in his mind and did not like the grammar of it. Not showed, not warned, brought. It implied a design whose first stages might have begun long before the camera surfaced from the glacier. Petra seemed to think the same thing. "You didn't just wait for us," she said. "You shaped the route." Voss's expression did not change, but he did not deny it. "I improved your chances of arriving before the site closed itself again." "By searching houses?" Klaus asked. "Not my method. By leaving coordinates in Petra's transceiver. That was mine. By sending the patch? No." The answer came too quickly to dismiss, yet too simply to trust. Klaus filed it away. Then whose? Petra asked. Voss's gaze moved briefly to the junction sign, to the dark fabric smear beneath the newer stencil. Those who still believe control is possible if they hold the upper systems long enough. Security, Klaus said. Successors. Fragments. Contractors inheriting purposes they no longer understand. The phrasing was maddening, but by now Klaus had learned that inside this place, direct language arrived only after pressure. You're saying there are other people in the dome? Yes. How many? I no longer know. Petra let out a dry, incredulous breath. You built a hidden climate installation under a mountain and lost count of who still works in it. We did not build this version, Voss said. We inherited layers. Then we became one of them. He turned and stepped fully through the pressure door before either of them agreed to follow. For a heartbeat, Klaus considered stopping him there, forcing clearer answers in the corridor. But the old man moved with the weary decisiveness of someone whose usefulness depended on motion rather than explanation. If they lost him now, the interior would reduce at once to blind geometry. Klaus gestured once to Petra. Stay close. Then they followed. Beyond the junction, the maintenance passage widened into a service tunnel whose scale changed everything. The walls were no longer close enough to brush with a shoulder. The ceiling rose overhead in a segmented curve, supported by ribbed metal arches, each tagged with faded alphanumeric markings and newer strips of sensor tape curling away from corrosion. Pipes ran along both sides, some intact, some cracked open and furred with mineral bloom. Emergency lamps in protective cages glowed at intervals with the weak amber tone of a system surviving on reduced power and stubborn design. The air changed too. Higher up, the shaft had smelled of ice, rust, and old machinery. Here, beneath that, another layer emerged. Humid, organic, faintly green. Not rot exactly. Growth. A warm biological note so out of place under thousands of tons of glacial mass that Klaus felt it first as disbelief. Petra noticed it too. So the environment isn't sealed dead, she said. No, Voss replied without looking back. Dead is one of the few states this place resists. They passed recessed storage alcoves emptied long ago of tools and carts. On one wall, a painted direction arrow pointed toward Klima Kern, Personalschleuser, the letters partly obscured by later warning tape. Another sign, newer and hastily bolted over the original, read Zutritt nur mit Autorisierung Stufe Beta, access only with beta-level authorization. The juxtaposition of eras made Klaus increasingly uneasy. Cold War fonts beneath modern security language, old climate diagrams beside recent hazard placards. This was not one hidden project. It was a stratified habitat of secrecy, updated by generations of caretakers who inherited both the facility and the fear attached to it. At the first sealed bulkhead, Voss stopped and pressed his palm against a dead access plate. Nothing happened. He gave a small nod, as if confirming something expected, then produced a mechanical override key from inside his coat. Brass, heavy, old. You kept keys, Petra said. I kept one. For what reason? Klaus asked. Voss inserted the key into a covered slot and turned it with visible effort. Because I stopped believing that controlled forgetting was a permanent solution. The bulkhead answered with a groan of reluctant hydraulics and opened 10 centimeters. Enough for a hand. Enough for Voss to reach inside and tug a release lever. Metal shuddered. The door pulled wider with a long inward scrape. Humidity spilled through the gap, not imagined humidity, not a trace. A genuine wash of warm air touched with soil, leaf matter, and stagnant water. Klaus stepped through and stopped dead. On the other side, the tunnel ended at a high observation gallery overlooking an interior space so large his mind rejected it before his eyes could accept it. The valley from the photographs was real. Not an outdoor valley under alpine sky, but a colossal enclosed biome stretching away beneath the curve of the dome's inner shell. Artificial daylight panels, many dead and many still faintly alive, hung like secondary horizons above a landscape of meadows, low woodland, water channels, terraced slopes, and fogged greenhouse structures half consumed by vegetation. The far ceiling disappeared into darkness, where support lattices and lighting arrays merged into shadow. Along one sector, the inner shell had fractured, allowing glacial intrusion to hang in blue-white curtains from above. Elsewhere, warmth still held. Green persisted in stubborn islands. Broad leaves shone darkly. Fern masses climbed old service towers. A stream reflected pallid system light like a vein of mercury. For a moment, none of them spoke. Klaus had seen disaster zones, avalanche bowls, collapsed hostels, aircraft impacts in rock fields. He knew what large, unnatural scenes did to the human mind. They reduced language first. This place did something worse. It made language seem provincial. Petra was the one who finally found a sentence. My God! Voss looked not at the valley, but at them. Now you understand why maps were insufficient. Klaus barely heard him. His attention had locked onto the meadow below the gallery. It was the same clearing, altered by time, overgrowth, and system decay, but unmistakable. The stream bend matched the second photograph. The low rise beyond it matched the frame where Matthias had turned over his shoulder. And to the right, near a stand of extinct-looking broadleaf plants, now towering and half-wild, lay the rusted frame of an old environmental survey cart. The valley in the images had not been a hallucination, not a fabrication, not a hidden alpine basin at all. It had been a functioning interior climate chamber buried beneath the Watzmann, large enough to mimic weather, horizon, and ecological history. The sight hit Klaus with an almost physical violence because it rearranged blame in ways he had spent 30 years avoiding. The climbers had not merely become lost. They had crossed into a manufactured world. His search, no matter how brave or disciplined or prolonged, had been seeking them in the wrong reality. He gripped the railing harder than he needed to. Petra noticed. Klaus? I'm all right. No, you're not. Voss said quietly, that part will wait. Klaus turned on him at once. You told me they were tracked for 31 hours. From where? The old man pointed across the valley to a cluster of observation modules built into the opposite interior wall. Most windows were dark. One still held a dim, intermittent glow. Control Annex 2. We monitored movement from there after the transition event. The primary command sector had already gone unstable. Then take us there. In time. No. Klaus's voice sharpened with the old field authority he had not meant to use. Now. Voss considered him for a beat, then nodded. The gallery route is compromised. We use the lower traverse. They descended by an interior stairwell encased in wire mesh and peeling hazard paint. Several flights down, the temperature rose abruptly. Condensation formed on Klaus's collar. His glasses would have fogged if he still wore them. Somewhere close by, water dripped through metal onto wet stone in a slow, resonant pattern. The lower they went, the stronger the biological smell became. Not decay, but enclosed abundance, left too long without pruning or human hierarchy. At the base of the stairwell, a service door opened onto the valley floor. Klaus stepped into the biome and felt the strangest inversion of his life. He was inside a mountain, yet the ground beneath his boots was soft with damp soil and rooted plant matter. Warm air moved lightly across his face. The stream nearby sounded like any low mountain watercourse in late spring. Above, not sky, but a curving shell of fractured light arrays and shadowed structural ribs pretended badly at day. Petra crouched near the stream bank. These plants, Voss answered without slowing. Some are reconstruction lines, some are legacy contamination from earlier biomes, some should not have survived at all. That is not a scientific category, Petra said. No, he agreed. It is the honest one. They crossed the clearing from the photographs in silence. Klaus could not help glancing down, half expecting to find footprints preserved by myth rather than time. Instead, there were only broken stems, damp soil, and the relics of systems long misaligned. A weather mast lay bent under vine growth. Small ceramic markers protruded from moss with illegible sample codes. Farther on, a metal placard hung crooked from a post. Zone T4, temperate transition ecology, the same impossible phrase the photographs had carried without words. Temperate transition. Under alpine ice. At the woodland edge, Petra stopped again. Something pale lay half sunk in the roots of a fern cluster. She pushed aside leaves and lifted it free. A climbing helmet. Red once, now dulled brown with age and mineral staining, but still carrying a white strip of tape across the rear. On the tape, in block letters almost erased by time, Ebnir. For several seconds, nobody moved. Klaus took the helmet from her with both hands. It was lighter than it should have been. The shell had a long crack near the temple, but no crushing impact. Inside, the foam lining had degraded into flakes. One chin strap remained intact. Matthias Ebner had been here, not just in the photographs, here in this air, under this artificial light, long enough to lose part of his equipment and never retrieve it. Voss watched Klaus carefully. There are more traces. Traces are not enough, Klaus said. I know. They continued toward the control annex on a narrow concrete path, almost invisible beneath moss. Twice they passed camera mounts blackened by heat or time. Once, Petra pointed out a section of ground where the turf had been disturbed more recently than the surrounding growth, as if someone had dragged something heavy across it within the last months rather than the last decades. Voss saw it and said nothing. The annex itself rose from the interior wall like a bunker inserted into a greenhouse. Reinforced concrete, narrow windows, external conduit trunks running like exposed arteries into the dome. The main door hung slightly ajar, paint blistered from humidity. Above it, another sign, partly flaked away. Annex 2, Beobachtung, Retrieval, Containment. Observation, Retrieval, Containment. Klaus felt Petra go tense beside him. Retrieval, she said, so they really did try. Voss opened the door wider. Inside, the annex smelled of mold, dust, ozone, and paper long kept from sunlight. Emergency lights pulsed weakly in the corridor. Rooms opened on either side. A debrief chamber with overturned chairs. A map room stripped of public labels and replaced by internal sector boards. A lab space where dead monitors sat behind cracked glass. On one wall, half torn down, hung a weather transition model showing the mountain exterior overlaid with colored flow lines reaching into the dome's climate envelope. Boundary failure, Klaus thought. Not metaphor, engineering term. Voss led them into a records room at the rear and stopped before a steel cabinet bolted to the floor. This is why time matters, he said. He bent, opened the cabinet with another key, and withdrew a thick binder sealed in cloudy plastic. The cover label had faded, but not beyond reading. Incident 14-2-94, transition breach, external subjects. Petra made a small sound that was not quite a curse. Klaus reached for the binder. Voss did not pull it away. Inside were pages of tracking notes, system logs, observation stills, and hurried typed summaries stamped across multiple departments. The first pages documented the breach in procedural language, weather anomaly, climate scene destabilization, and unplanned ingress of 4 external adults into T4 ecological zone. Subsequent pages became more human despite themselves. External subjects alert. External subjects species responsive to environment. Subject B collecting plant samples. Subject A attempting route assessment. Subject D displaying signs of cold stress resolving after exposure to interior climate. Alive, documented alive. Klaus turned page after page with fingers that had begun to shake. Grainy surveillance stills showed the climbers moving through the valley, then entering a service structure, then later near the stream. One image captured Karin looking directly toward a camera point she could not possibly have seen. Another showed Daniel seated against a survey cart, head lowered, while Matthias argued with someone just outside frame. Who were they talking to? Petra asked. Voss said nothing. Klaus turned another page and found the answer in a clipped notation. Initial contact made by internal Team C. Internal. Not only climbers and observers, there had been personnel down here when the 4 entered. The next sequence of logs moved rapidly. Corridor instability, retrieval delay, power rerouting, disagreement between containment and rescue commands. Rising ecological cross-contamination, loss of central comms. Then, midway through the binder, the most important line so far. External subjects escorted toward lift spine east at 2112. Klaus looked up. Escorted? Yes, Voss said. By whom? By personnel assigned to internal retrieval. Then where are the records after 2112? Petra asked. Voss did not answer, because there were none. The pages that followed had been removed, not torn by age, cut cleanly from the binding. Klaus felt the decisive investigation shift under his feet. They had reached the crucial place, entered the annex, and uncovered the official internal record proving the climbers survived the initial breach. but the final path toward truth had been severed at the point where rescue, disappearance, and responsibility converged. Petra was already scanning the room for secondary files. There has to be a duplicate. There was, Voss said quietly. Was, Klaus snapped. The old man looked toward the rear door at the end of the records room, in the lower archive. Then we go there. Voss did not move. Instead, he said, with an exhaustion that sounded almost like warning, if we open the lower archive, the remaining live sectors will know exactly where we are. Before Klaus could answer, a harsh electronic tone burst to life somewhere deeper in the annex. 1 pulse. 2. Then a recorded system voice, female and cold, sounding over dormant speakers throughout the buried biome. Unauthorized archival access detected. Security route reopening. Please remain where you are. The old dome, it seemed, had finally noticed them. The recorded voice did not belong to any sentry Klaus trusted. It came through the annex speakers with that same old institutional female neutrality once used in hospitals, rail systems, and civil defense bunkers. A voice engineered to remain calm while human decisions collapsed around it. Unauthorized archival access detected. Security route reopening. Please remain where you are. The sentence repeated once, slightly warped by failing circuitry, then cut off beneath a rising mechanical vibration that seemed to spread outward through the walls, the floor, and the damp air of the buried valley itself. Petra was already moving. Lower archive, she said. Voss did not block the way, but he did not hide the cost in his face either. If the east route reopens, you have minutes, perhaps less. Then don't spend them speaking like a bulletin, Petra snapped. Klaus had already taken the incident binder and sealed it under his arm. The missing pages after 2112 burned in his mind like a wound. Escorted toward lift spine east. Then nothing. 30 years of lie and silence had narrowed now to a final corridor, a final missing set of documents, a final buried layer between the 4 climbers and whatever had become of them. Where? He said. Voss pointed to the rear door. The old man moved with them this time, faster than Klaus expected. The corridor behind the records room descended in a tightening spiral, lit by intermittent strips of sour white emergency light. Water ran along one wall in narrow channels and disappeared through grated drains. On every landing, metal signs appeared under peeling sealant. Archiv TF, Biologische Protokolle. Archiv TF, Personal und Zugangslogs. Archiv TF, Retrieval Documentation. The words had the blunt cruelty of things named before anyone expected morality to matter later. The deeper they went, the stronger the machine vibration became. Not loud yet, but urgent. Systems waking in sectors that should have stayed dead. Somewhere above them, across the valley, a bank of artificial daylight panels flared and dimmed, sending ghost-like pulses through the stairwell windows. Petra glanced up once and said what Klaus was already thinking. They're reopening the place around us. Yes, Voss said. For whom? He did not answer. At the base of the spiral, they reached a sealed steel hatch with a mechanical wheel lock. Unlike the upper doors, this one still had power. A thin green line glowed beside the frame. The surface was warmer than the corridor air, slightly damp under Klaus's glove. Voss produced a second key from inside his coat. Petra stared at him. How many keys have you been carrying around all these years? Fewer than I should have. The lock turned with a grinding internal protest. When the hatch opened, stale, warm air spilled out, carrying the unmistakable smell of paper, mold, lubricants, and something older, like dust sealed so long it had become a climate of its own. The lower archive was not a room. It was a chamber. Rows of steel shelving extended into shadow under a low curved ceiling, crossed by conduit and insulated pipe. Filing cabinets stood in numbered banks. Boxes with faded security stamps were stacked on rolling pallets. Humidity had curled labels and blistered cardboard, but much of the archive remained intact through sheer over-engineering. At the far end, behind a mesh partition, sat a smaller secured vault with red-striped trim around the frame. Klaus felt something shift inside him that had nothing to do with triumph. This was the accumulated weight of a concealed reality. Decades of decisions, reports, losses, adjustments, corrections. the paper architecture that allowed an impossible world under a mountain to continue existing while the outer world buried its witnesses one by one. Voss pointed toward the mesh vault. Retrieval incidents, personnel loss, boundary event records. That is where the uncut sequence should be. Should. Again the careful word. Klaus crossed the chamber quickly, boots ringing on the metal grate floor. Petra moved beside him, headlamp beam catching box labels as they passed. Zone T2 Flora Failures. Psychological Adaptation Series. Boundary Tests, Winter Phase. The sheer obscenity of the language would have stunned him if the urgency had left room for emotion. But urgency was narrowing everything now. The vibration in the floor had risen another degree. Somewhere distant, a door slammed shut with automated force. Somewhere else, an alarm tone began and was abruptly cut off. At the mesh vault, Voss used the second key again and entered a 4-digit override on a dead keypad that seemed to accept the sequence out of memory rather than electricity. The door unlocked. Inside, the files were denser, better preserved, more deliberately organized. Retrieval operations, internal deaths, external contact incidents, transition failures by date. And there, on the third shelf, a grey binder thicker than the one Klaus already carried. Incident 14-294, continued tracking. East spine retrieval. Klaus pulled it down with both hands. The first pages were still present. 2119. External subjects escorted by internal Team C toward lift spine. East, due to corridor destabilization and ecological contamination risk. 2126. Subject D, Seifert, unable to continue at previous pace. Team halts near Agricultural Gallery 2. 2131. Subject B, Vogel, requests explanation of site. Internal team declines. 2134. Subject A, Ebner, attempts unauthorized access to comm panel. 2138. Power fluctuation in spine east. Lift system unavailable. 2142. Command disagreement between annex retrieval and core containment. Klaus kept turning pages. There were surveillance stills here too, sharper than the others. Matthias standing between two uniformed internal personnel, his posture tense but controlled. Karin looking directly into the camera line with an expression Klaus would not forget. Not panic, not yet, but comprehension arriving too quickly. Uwe with one hand against a wall, exhausted. Daniel pale but upright. Alive. All four alive well into the night. Petra leaned in to read over his shoulder. Keep going. He did. 2157. East spine route compromised by internal shell shift. 2203. Emergency proposal filed. Expose auxiliary vent line to create external rescue landmark. 2205. Proposal denied pending contamination review. Petra made a sound like a swallowed curse. Denied. A way to mark the site from the mountain above had existed, and someone had refused it. Klaus felt a wave of such concentrated fury that for a second the print blurred in front of him. Go on, he told himself. 2212. Subjects informed delay temporary. 2217. Subject C, Hartner, reports hearing exterior wind through shell seam. 2221. Subject B notes stars visible where no stars should be. 2224. Second power loss. Lighting inversion in T4 sector. Lighting inversion. 2 systems of illumination. 2 shadows. Then 2231. Internal Team C loses contact with core. 2234. Directive conflict received from upper security route. 2236. Subject group diverted from spine east to vent corridor 7. Klaus stopped breathing for half a second. Vent corridor 7, the route that should have led toward rescue, had changed. Not because the climbers chose it, because someone redirected them. Why? Petra asked, though no one in the room could answer from one line alone. Voss's face had gone visibly paler. That is not what I was told happened. Klaus turned the next page. 2240. Internal Team C divided. 2 personnel remain with subjects. 1 returns to Annex 2 under protest. 2248. Manual alarm triggered at Vent Corridor 7. 2249. Video feed lost. 2252. Bioseal procedure recommended. 2254, bioseal authorized by acting security oversight. For a second, the words meant nothing. Then they meant too much. Petra understood at the same instant. Bioseal, she said. They sealed the corridor with the climbers still in it. No one contradicted her. Klaus turned the page with fingers that had stopped feeling entirely his own. The next section was typed later, under review language colder than any he had yet seen. Final status of external subjects, unresolved beyond Corridor 7 boundary event. Body recovery, negative. Confirmed fatalities, internal personnel C2, C3. Material recoveries, partial. Recommended narrative for external jurisdiction. Severe weather loss, unrecoverable alpine fatality. There it was. Not only the truth, but the moment truth was replaced. The families had not been denied certainty because none existed. They had been denied because institutional language found its cleanest surviving story and laid it over the breach like fresh snow. Klaus stood absolutely still, binder open in his hands, while 30 years of self-accusation reassembled into something more ruinous and more precise. He had called off the search because the weather would have killed more people. That was still true, but he had spent decades believing that decision ended the story. It had not. The real ending had occurred below the mountain, in rooms where men spoke of contamination and authorization, while 4 living people waited at a blocked route for rescue that never came. And then even that ending had remained incomplete, unresolved beyond Corridor 7 boundary event. No bodies, no certainty. Petra read past him now, scanning the remainder of the file. There's an annex. Klaus turned forward. A smaller packet had been clipped to the back of the binder. Handwritten notes, not official logs. Personal memorandum from Annex 2, initialed AV, Adrian Voss. The old man looked at the pages as if he had not seen them in years, perhaps had hoped never to. Klaus read aloud before he could stop himself. At 2311, the subjects were no longer visible on Corridor 7 feed due to particulate bloom and light failure. At 2314, a moving source was observed beyond the bioseal line from inside the sealed sector. Not one light, but 2. Height and interval inconsistent with personnel lamps. At 2317, Subject B believed audible through shell microphone, though phrase indistinct. At 2320, all sensors in Vent 7 registered simultaneous environmental inversion. After this point, no ordinary spatial reporting can be trusted. The room seemed to contract around the words. 2 moving lights beyond the sealed sector. Subject B, Karin, possibly heard after the corridor was sealed. And then the sentence that shattered procedure itself. No ordinary spatial reporting can be trusted. Not only were the climbers abandoned inside the hidden biosphere. After the seal, something happened in Corridor 7 that broke the rules the installation itself had been built to defend. Petra looked up slowly. This is why there are no bodies. Voss did not answer, because he did not need to. Klaus felt then, with dreadful clarity, that the final evidence they had found was not closure, but an aperture into something morally worse. The file proved the climbers lived, were redirected, and were sealed away. It exposed the betrayal at the heart of the cover-up. But it also made the vanished bodies harder, not easier to understand. And that was when the lower archive lights cut out. Total darkness dropped like a blow. For half a second, only their headlamps existed, crossing wildly over shelves, metal, damp air. Voss's face, Petra's raised arm. Then the chamber lurched. Not from explosion. From somewhere deep in the dome, an enormous structural shift rolled upward through the floor like the turning of a buried continent. Boxes toppled from the nearest shelf. A pipe burst overhead, spraying warm condensation and rust. The alarm voice returned, no longer calm but fragmented. Containment. Failure. East sectors. Seal. Seal. Petra grabbed the binder from Klaus before it could fall. Move! But Voss had not moved. He was staring past them, toward the rear wall of the vault, where a panel hidden behind shelving had slid halfway open under the power loss. Beyond it lay a narrow service tunnel, and inside that tunnel, illuminated by a stuttering wash of emergency red, stood a figure in a faded climbing jacket. For one impossible second, Klaus thought it was Matthias Ebner stepping out of 1994. Then the light shifted, and he saw the truth was stranger. It was a woman, Older now, gaunt, bareheaded, one hand on the tunnel frame, and on the wall behind her, in a trembling line of grease pencil written years ago or minutes ago, were 3 words: "We didn't die." For a fraction of a second, no one in the lower archive moved. The red emergency wash stuttered over the hidden tunnel, the half-open panel, the steel shelving thrown into crooked shadows, and the woman standing beyond the frame with one hand braced against the wall as if even remaining upright required negotiation. Water hissed from the ruptured pipe overhead. Somewhere deeper in the dome, a heavy door slammed shut with such force that the sound arrived through the floor rather than the air. "We didn't die." The words on the wall behind her had been written in thick grease pencil, the letters uneven and urgent, pressed hard enough to gouge faint tracks into the painted metal beneath. Not a dramatic message left for strangers, a field statement, a record against erasure. Petra reached instinctively for Klaus's arm, not to restrain him, but to verify that the scene in front of them existed in shared reality. The woman stepped forward into the stuttering red light. Her jacket had once been alpine blue beneath the grime and age. One sleeve had been repaired with careful, almost obsessive stitching. Her hair, what remained of it, was cut short with a knife rather than scissors. Her face was narrow, deeply lined, and marked by the kind of pallor indoor light and long nutritional compromise carved into living skin. But the eyes, steady, grey-green and painfully alert, did not belong to a ghost. They belonged to a survivor. Klaus knew her before his mind accepted that he knew her. Not from age, not from this body shaped by decades he had never allowed into the story. He knew her from the photographs, from an emergency contact card, from a headband mentioned in a family conversation that had ended in tears in February 1994. "Karen," he said. The woman's expression changed very slightly. Not into recognition, into the effort required to hold recognition at a distance long enough to test whether it was safe. "Who is asking?" she said. Her voice was rougher than he expected and lower than the one he had imagined over 30 years of absence. But it was unmistakably human, not recorded, not hallucinated, not a projection produced by a hidden system. Adrian Voss made a soft sound that was almost a gasp. Petra turned on him at once. "You knew?" "No," he said, and whatever else he had lied about, the word arrived with enough shock to sound true. "I believed there were possibilities. I did not know." Klaus stepped forward one pace, then stopped himself. The old instinct to close distance had to be broken now. A woman who had survived 3 decades in a sealed anomaly under a mountain owed no one the comfort of trust. "My name is Klaus Reinhardt," he said carefully. "I coordinated the rescue search in 1994. Karen's gaze stayed on his face for a long second. Then she said, in a tone emptied of accusation, only because accusation had become too small a tool, "Yes, I remember your weather brief." The sentence struck him harder than any shouted blame could have. She remembered. Not the memorial version, not the version preserved in clipped press language and municipal condolence. The actual brief, the actual day. A point of living continuity, stretching from the storm into this red-lit chamber, straight through all the years Klaus had spent grieving a dead woman who had, in some impossible and terrible sense, remained alive under the mountain. Petra recovered first. "Can you walk?" Karen gave her a look that might once have been humor, with negotiation. Another shudder rolled through the archive chamber. A bank of shelves toppled somewhere beyond the vault with a chain of metallic crashes. The alarm system crackled back to life over the speakers. East sectors compromised. Core isolation in progress. Non-essential personnel proceed to upper routes. Klaus looked from the tunnel to Adrian Voss. "Explain, now." But Karen answered before he could. "There isn't time for all of it." She lifted one thin hand and pointed past them, deeper into the archive chamber. "If the core is isolating, the upper routes will be sealed first. They don't want witnesses leaving with records." Petra glanced at the binders under her arm. "They?" Karen's eyes shifted briefly toward Voss, then away again. "Whoever inherited the idea that the mountain belongs more to a system than to the people it swallowed." The sentence hung in the ruined archive like judgment. Klaus saw Voss absorb it without defense. Perhaps because, after 30 years of containment language, there was no sentence left that could protect him from a living survivor. "We need the route," Petra said. Karin nodded once. Not the route you came in by. They'll close that. There's an old ventilation spine running below Agricultural Gallery 2. It rises into the outer shell north of the melt seam. Klaus stared at her. You know a way out. Karin met his gaze directly for the first time. I know several. Most of them no longer lead where they once did. The old phrase from the mountains returned in altered form. Places that do not stay where they belong. Petra stepped closer to Karin and quickly assessed her with the ruthless gentleness of a medic. Pupils equal, skin cold but not shock white, dehydration obvious, left knee unstable, right hand scarred by old burns or chemical exposure. Beneath the jacket collar, along the neck, ran a web of faint pale lines like healed pressure injuries or old sensor contact sites. How long since you were topside? Petra asked. Karin's answer came without visible emotion. 1994. Even expecting it, Klaus felt the words pass through him like a structural failure. Petra did not visibly flinch. Then you move between internal sectors. When the boundaries allow it, when the sealed people lose interest, when the systems misbehave in useful ways. The sealed people? Klaus asked. Karin's mouth tightened. The ones still loyal to procedure after procedure forgot the world above was continuing without them. The dome groaned again, louder now. Somewhere overhead, glass or acrylic fractured in a descending burst. Warm, wet air pushed through the hidden tunnel behind Karin, carrying plant smell, mold, and a chemical tang Klaus could not identify. He looked at the wall message again. We didn't die, plural. The realization hit him with such force he almost missed his next breath. Not only you, he said. Karin's face did not soften, but something in it acknowledged the question. No. Who else? She answered with the simplicity of someone too tired for ceremony. Matthias, for a long time. Daniel less. Uwe, in another way. Klaus felt Petra go still beside him. For a long time, Petra repeated. Karin gave a small nod. Time works badly here. Badly, but not always kindly. That should have begged explanation. It should have opened into theories, devices, manipulations of climate, psychology, chronology. But the chamber was shaking harder now, and the immediate truth mattered more than the elegant one. They were not dealing with a simple survival story, nor with a simple death. The truth exposed in the binders that the 4 climbers had been sealed away alive was already devastating enough to bury institutions. But Karin's existence pushed it beyond scandal into something the outer world would struggle even to name. Not all of them had died in 1994. Some had endured, some perhaps had changed. And the men who chose containment over rescue had not merely hidden fatalities, they had buried survivors. Klaus felt the strongest opposition he had ever faced, not as a person, but as a whole architecture. Decades of official narrative, classified inheritance, successor security culture, scientific euphemism, and now the physical closing of the dome itself around the evidence. Against that, his grief, Petra's medic's certainty, Miriam's rebellion, and a few binders of paper looked absurdly small. And yet they were what remained. A violent clanging erupted in the main archive chamber. Petra swung her headlamp toward the vault door just as a beam of white tactical light cut across the shelves beyond. Not system light, handheld, then voices. 3, maybe 4 people moving hard through the archive, speaking clipped German over each other. Sector breached. Check the lower vault. Alive or not, nothing leaves. Petra swore under her breath. So much for abstract successors. Karin moved faster than any of them expected. She reached into the hidden tunnel wall and pulled a recessed lever hidden behind conduit lagging. Somewhere deep overhead, a vent shutter slammed open. The sudden suction changed the air pressure in the room. Papers lifted, one hanging bulb burst. They'll come through the front, she said. We go through the wall. Klaus grabbed both binders and shoved them into his pack. Petra took the cassette recorder, the map fragments, and the helmet marked Ebner. Voss remained where he was for a fraction too long, staring toward the approaching lights as if recognition had finally caught up with him. Klaus, Petra snapped. Move him or leave him. That was the decision, brutal and immediate. The old man had been part of the machinery that condemned the climbers to this buried afterlife. He had also brought Klaus and Petra here, opened the archive, and allowed the truth to break surface. Saving him would slow them. Leaving him would mean abandoning the only living architect of the cover-up, besides whatever men were now approaching through the shelves. Klaus looked at Voss. The older man seemed to understand the arithmetic in his face. "If they take me," he said quietly, "they restore procedure. Not apology, not plea. A professional assessment from the ruins of professional ethics." Klaus hated him for making the answer useful. "Then walk," he said. They went into the wall. The hidden tunnel behind Karin was narrower than the service passages above, more improvised, more lived in. Old maintenance access had been reshaped with salvaged rails, hanging cables, crates turned into shelves, and marks on the wall that were not official notations at all, but human counting systems. Days, perhaps, or seasons, or power cycles. Klaus did not ask. Behind them, the lower archive erupted in sound. Boots shouted commands, metal shelving dragged aside. One voice shouting Voss's name with the brittle authority of someone who still believed hierarchy existed in an emergency. The tunnel bent twice, then opened briefly onto a narrow overlook above the biome. And there, under failing light, Klaus saw the deeper scale of what had been hidden. Across the artificial valley, other sectors moved. Not empty greenhouse decay, not mere vegetation and dead apparatus. Figures, distant, difficult to count, crossing raised walkways or standing at monitoring stations lit by emergency red, some in recent field gear, some in old institutional coveralls, some moving with coordination, others with the half-uncertain gait of people adapted to a place whose systems had been unreliable for too long. An entire concealed human remainder. The truth was bigger than one cover-up, bigger than 4 lost climbers, though they remained at its moral center. The buried dome had become a population, a continuity, a branch of history denied formal existence and now fighting over whether the surface world would finally be allowed to know. Petra saw it too and whispered, not in fear but in grim astonishment, "They built a second world and forgot to end it." Karin heard her. "No," she said, "they kept trying." The tunnel rose steeply after that. Klaus's knee flared. Voss began to stumble, and twice Petra had to haul him by the elbow with more force than dignity. Behind them came intermittent pursuit. Lights glimpsed through grates the bark of orders, then silence where the hidden route forked and crossed dead ventilation space. At one junction, Karin stopped before a corroded hatch wheel and pushed aside a curtain of thick fern growth that had somehow penetrated this deep into the structure. Painted on the metal beneath, almost erased by time, was the designation Vent 7 Aux. Manual emergency purge. Klaus stared. Corridor 7, the sealed route, the unresolved boundary event, the place where surveillance had failed and ordinary spatial reporting had ceased to apply. Karin rested one hand on the hatch for a moment, not sentimentally, more like recognition offered to a wound. "Matthias wanted this opened from the other side," she said. Her voice stayed level, but something under it moved. "He thought if we could force the purge, the mountain would hear us." Klaus swallowed once. "Did it?" She looked at him, and in her face he saw at last the full human cost of all the euphemisms in the binders. "For a moment," she said, "then they chose silence." She turned the wheel. The hatch fought, then gave. Cold outer air knifed inward through the gap, carrying snow grains and the mineral smell of fresh melt. Above them lay darkness, real mountain darkness, and the faint indifferent light of a world that had continued all these years. But escape was not yet secure. An alarm began again below, louder and angrier now, joined by a second voice over the failing speakers, male, live, not recorded. "Attention all sectors, surface breach in progress, recover subjects, no external release. No external release." The phrase followed them like a curse as they climbed the narrow ventilation shaft toward the shell. Halfway up, Voss slipped. Klaus caught him by the harness web Petra had improvised from spare line, and in that suspended second, the old man looked up with a face stripped finally of systems, ranks, and defensive vocabulary. "I wrote the first false summary," he said. The confession came as if torn out by gravity itself. "I signed the weather narrative because once rescue became impossible, I wanted one mercy left for the families, a clean death. I told myself that was kindness." Klaus held him there, arms straining, wind cutting down the shaft, the binders pressing hard against his back. "It wasn't," Voss said. "No," Klaus answered. "It was the only judgment there was time for." They pulled him up. At the top of the shaft, the shell opened into a fractured vent collar half buried in ice. Snow blew across the gap under a sky not yet morning, but no longer full night. The mountain outside looked impossibly simple after the biome below. Rock, storm, cold, exposure, the honest violence of nature compared with the curated violence of concealment. Karin emerged last before Petra, bracing herself against the outer ring as if the open air itself were another kind of instability. She looked once across the black alpine slopes at the stars intermittently visible through torn cloud, and for the first time since they had seen her in the hidden tunnel, her composure cracked. Not into tears, into awe so raw it bordered on pain. Behind them, from somewhere far beneath the shell, came a heavy sequence of sealing impacts. The dome was closing sectors again, and down in the red-lit dark, the remainder of its buried history was either being locked away forever or preparing to rise with them. The mountain did not greet them. It received them the way mountains received everything, without surprise, without relief, and without any obligation to distinguish between the buried and the returned. Snow moved low across the upper slope in fine horizontal streams. The pre-dawn dark was thinning at the far edge of the world, not into warmth, but into a harder grade of grey. Klaus hauled himself clear of the fractured vent collar and rolled onto ice-scabbed rock, breathing in air so cold and clean it hurt. After the damp, living heat of the buried biome, the Bavarian night above the Wotzman felt almost theoretical, too sharp and empty to be trusted. Petra came up behind him, then Adrian Voss, then finally Karin Vogel, one hand gripping the broken metal rim until her fingers whitened. She stayed there for several seconds, half within the shaft and half outside it, as if the distinction still required proof. Klaus turned back toward her. The first natural wind to touch her face in 32 years lifted the short rough ends of her hair and pressed the collar of her old jacket against her throat. She shut her eyes once, briefly, not with sentimentality, but with the expression of someone trying to understand whether memory and sensation had finally agreed to occupy the same world. Below them, hidden under the mountain's frozen mass, something vast was still moving. The sealing impacts continued through the ice in delayed shocks, deep metallic closures rolling up through stone and snow. Farther along the exposed curve of the shell, dark seams were vanishing again as wind-blown powder gathered over the structure's revealed surfaces. Melt and collapse had given the dome back for a few narrow hours. Now the mountain and the system below seemed to be negotiating a new burial. Petra looked upslope and swore softly. "We do not have long." She was right. The weather had turned while they were below. Not a full blizzard yet, but enough instability moving through the higher ridges to make descent a problem measured in minutes rather than comfort. Wind loaded one flank of the traverse and stripped the other to blue glare ice. The route they had climbed under cover of dark now looked more fragile in the first thin light. Every delay increased the chance of losing footing, line, or each other. And yet none of them moved immediately, because between them stood everything the outer world did not yet know. 2 incident binders, proving the 1994 expedition survived the storm and entered the hidden installation alive. Decades of internal records documenting containment and redirection. A living witness who should have been dead by every official account, and Adrian Voss, the man who had helped translate catastrophe into administrative fiction, and had now, too late and too partially, chosen disclosure over control. The truth had surfaced. But exposure and survival were not yet the same thing. Klaus knelt by his pack and checked the waterproof seals again, though he had already checked them twice. The binders were there. Petra had the cassette recorder and the helmet marked Ebnir clipped to her gear. Karin stood leaning against the shell with a steadiness that looked like discipline and was, Klaus suspected, mostly exhaustion. Then Petra asked the question none of them had allowed themselves yet. What about the others? Karin opened her eyes. The wind moved between them with a dry hiss over ice. "Daniel died the first winter after the seals," she said. No one interrupted. "He was younger than the rest of us, but younger is not always stronger when systems change faster than people do. He still believed for too long that someone would reopen the correct route if we followed the instructions and stayed visible. Her voice did not break. It thinned only slightly. When that stopped being possible for him, Matthias carried him farther than he should have. After that, she looked down toward the hidden structure beneath their boots, toward a place none of them could see and all of them now carried. After that, we stopped counting time by calendars. Klaus held his breath without meaning to. And Uwe? Petra asked quietly. Karin's face changed in a way harder to watch than grief. Uwe adapted first, she said, too well. He understood the roots, the broken systems, the cycles of failure and warmth. He could move through the old service sectors when the others still thought in maps from above. But adaptation has a price. The deeper levels alter people, or perhaps they only expose what isolation chooses in them. What happened to him? Klaus asked. Karin met his eyes directly. He chose the sealed side. He said the world above had already finished with us, and that survival belonged to whoever understood the dome better than memory did. The answer carried more than one loss. Not only death, defection, transformation. A human line crossing into something loyalty could no longer follow. And Matthias? Klaus asked. This time Karin looked away toward the paling eastern sky. For years he believed there would be a way to force evidence upward. He kept records, he learned the vents. He wrote messages where maintenance crews or security successors might one day have to see them. Some of those messages survived, most didn't. We didn't die. The grease pencil line in the lower archive came back to Klaus with fresh weight. He died? Petra said. Karin gave the smallest possible nod. Not in '94, not for a long time. The sentence landed in Klaus like delayed impact. Matthias Ebner had not simply survived the hidden breach. He had lived inside the buried system for years, documenting, resisting, trying to break the silence from below, while the world above engraved his name on plaques and anniversary notices. Klaus thought of the families, the memorial photographs, the administrative mercy Adrian Voss had once called kindness. There were no words now large enough to carry what had been denied to them. Behind them, deep in the vent shaft, another alarm rose, then cut. A harsher sound replaced it, manual machinery under strain, as if gates were being forced rather than merely closed. Voss turned sharply toward the opening. They're still moving in the east sectors, he said. Who? Petra asked. The successor teams, internal holdouts, whatever remains of site security with enough power to reopen routes. He looked at Klaus, and for the first time since the lower archive, there was open urgency rather than careful control in his face. If they reach the auxiliary shell exits before daylight, they can still frame this as a containment breach, a delusion, a criminal trespass into unstable military ruins, anything except the truth. Klaus knew he was right. The binders mattered, but paper alone could still be delayed, discredited, sealed in courts, dragged through classification until the living witness died and the public lost attention. The world they were returning to was more sophisticated than the one that had accepted a weather narrative in 1994. It was also better at smothering scandal beneath procedure. They needed more than records. They needed release. He took out his phone. No signal. Petra checked hers. Nothing. Too high, too unstable, too much rock between them and any tower line. Anna had the second envelope, but that would open only if they did not check in by afternoon. By then, the dome could be resealed. The exposed shell collapsed. The evidence beneath the mountain rearranged again by men who had inherited secrecy as a profession. Klaus looked down the slope towards the lower traverse where, in better weather, a descent route would eventually bring them into coverage. Eventually was not good enough. Then he remembered the old emergency launch charge markers from controlled avalanche work. Small directional signal devices once used to indicate unstable sectors to helicopter teams when radio contact failed. He still carried one modified flare unit in the outer side pocket of his pack, not because he expected to use it, but because retirement had never fully erased habit. Petra saw the thought form in his face. You're not serious. I might be. No. Her voice sharpened instantly. If you trigger instability on this shell, you could bring the whole exposed section down on us. Or expose more of it. Or kill Karin, or all of us. Karin was watching him now without intervening. Adrian Voss understood before Petra finished. "The outer shell is already compromised," he said. "A targeted slide could uncover the upper vent lattice and reveal the dome from the southern air corridors." Petra rounded on him. "And now you become enthusiastic?" He accepted the attack without defense. "I am describing the mechanics." Klaus looked from the fractured vent collar to the slope above, measuring load, angle, wind deposit, ice bond, shell curvature. The moral choice that had once existed as an abstract line in the story was now here in the cold with him. Trigger the mountain, risk burial, force exposure, or walk away with partial proof and let the old machinery have time to recover. If he chose wrongly, they died. If he chose caution, the truth might survive only as paper contested by institutions built for endurance. Petra stepped closer, close enough that he could see the exhaustion around her eyes under the frost on her lashes. "Don't do this for absolution." He met her gaze. Not absolution, he thought. Not even justice in the clean sense. The dead had already been denied too much for that word to remain simple. But perhaps exposure. A wound made visible enough that no later file could fully close it again. Karin spoke before he answered. "Matthias tried to make the mountain hear us from below," she said. "If you do this, do it for the living record, not the dead gesture." The sentence decided it. Klaus took out the flare charge unit. It was old, ugly, and brutally simple. Originally designed for signaling along avalanche perimeters, modified years ago for brighter directional output. Not an explosive in the dramatic sense, but enough force to shear unstable crust and announce itself to any morning patrol, helicopter route, or camera lens facing the ridge. He checked the angle against the overburden above the exposed shell seam. Petra cursed under her breath while helping him anyway, because field people who disagreed under pressure still preferred competence to argument. They set the charge in a narrow crack where blown snow had loaded against the outer shell curve. Klaus counted down from 5. The flare charge fired with a concussion sharp enough to punch the air out of his lungs. For one impossible instant, nothing happened. Then the slope above them gave way. Not the full mountain, only a slab section, but broad enough to rip downward over the exposed shell in a roaring cataract of powder, ice plates, and shattered crust. The fractured vent collar vanished in white. Petra tackled Karin sideways toward a rock outcrop. Klaus dragged Voss by the shoulder strap and dropped with him behind the same cover as the avalanche spill thundered over the dome. Snow and debris pounded past. The world became pressure, white noise, and impact. Then silence. Not complete silence. The stunned, hollow kind that follows a violence successfully survived by centimeters. Klaus pushed himself up, coughing snow crystals from his mouth, and looked back. The result was immediate. The slab had not buried the shell. It had torn more of it open. Across 30 meters of slope, the camouflage skin of Bioclimasphere 3 now lay exposed in brutal geometric clarity. Dark curved plating, vent arrays, service seams, warning stencils, and one collapsed section through which warm vapor streamed visibly into the freezing alpine dawn. No one looking from the air could mistake it now for natural terrain. At the same moment, far below in the valley, the first line of morning sun struck the upper ridges, and Klaus's phone vibrated. 1 bar, then 2, signal. He did not waste a second. He opened the camera, filmed the exposed shell, filmed Karin Vogel standing alive against the outer plating, filmed the stenciled Bioclimasphere. Marking beneath fresh avalanche dust, then began sending to everyone at once. Anna, Hannah Seidel, Miriam Voss, 3 journalists he had never expected to trust, 2 former rescue colleagues, and a national newspaper contact Petra still knew from an old mountain safety inquiry. The upload stalled, resumed, stalled again, then moved. Petra was already doing the same, transmitting scans of the binders page by page where coverage held. Karin stood in the open wind, one hand on the shell, face turned toward the harsh new daylight with the expression of someone unwilling to waste the sky. Adrian Voss watched the files leave their devices and said nothing. There was no speech he could make now that would not arrive 30 years too late. The strongest opposition came exactly as Klaus expected it would. A rotor beat rose from the southern side of the range. Not rescue. Too fast, too direct, too immediate. A helicopter climbed the ridgeline, matte dark against the morning light, swinging toward the exposed dome with institutional purpose. No visible markings at first angle. Then, as it banked, Klaus saw enough to know it was no civil mountain team. Petra looked up and swore. Down, they dropped behind the outcrop as the aircraft made its first pass over the newly exposed shell. A loudspeaker crackled, but the wind tore the words apart. Then the helicopter climbed again, circling, unable to land on the unstable slope, unable either to ignore the fact that the dome was now visible in full morning light. Klaus checked his phone. 3 messages sent, 2 still pending. Then 1 incoming. Anna. He answered at once. "I have it," she said before he could speak. Her voice was thin with adrenaline and something close to disbelief. "The files are coming through. I've already forwarded everything to 6 places." One of the journalists called back. He says there's already an image online from a hiker livestream in Ramsau. Something black under the snow on the east face. It's spreading. Klaus shut his eyes once in the freezing wind. Above them, the helicopter banked again. "It's out," Anna said. "Do you hear me? It's out." He heard her. He also heard beneath the rotor wash and the mountain wind, the lower, deeper sound still coming from inside the exposed shell. Closures, movements, the buried system trying to save what remained of itself before the surface world fully understood where to look. It would not end cleanly. He knew that even now. Governments would deny, committees would form, corporations would dissolve, records would disappear, and men who had inherited this hidden world would insist that what the public saw was fragmentary, misunderstood, contaminated by memory and isolation. There would be hearings, then counter-hearings. Survivors would be questioned until truth itself seemed impolite. And yet something irreversible had happened on the slope above the Watzmann. The sealed story had broken surface with living witness, material record, and a dome too large now to be wished back into geology. The mountain, which had carried the lie for decades, no longer looked natural enough to protect it. The descent took hours and did not remain graceful. Karin nearly collapsed twice, Voss once. Petra kept all of them moving through force of habit and medic's fury. As they dropped below the highest ice, the signal stabilized and the outside world arrived in fragments. Alerts, calls, message storms, journalists, officials suddenly eager to clarify preliminary narratives. Then national outlets publishing photographs faster than institutions could agree on language. By the time they reached the lower service road, police vehicles were already blocking one turnoff and reporters another. The hidden world beneath the mountain had become visible enough to attract the ordinary chaos of public truth. But even there, amid engines, microphones, thermal blankets, and the first stunned faces recognizing Karin Vogel from archival memorial photos, closure remained partial, because Matthias Ebner did not come out, nor Daniel, nor Uwe, and because when emergency crews later pushed back toward the exposed shell with full daylight, scanners and structural teams, they found what the avalanche had already begun to enforce. The entrance Karin had used with them was gone, collapsed, sealed, or shifted beyond the geometry by which they had escaped. The mountain and the dome beneath it had moved together one last time, burying the direct route as if the hidden world still retained one final reflex against complete surrender. In the weeks that followed, newspapers printed the image that changed everything. Not the dome first, not the stenciled shell, not even the binders. The image was one of the old recovered photographs from 1994, published beside a current photograph of Karin Vogel wrapped in a rescue blanket, her face lined by impossible years. In the old image, the 4 climbers stood inside the false valley under 2 directions of light. In the new one, only one of them stood under real mountain weather. Across Germany and beyond, people argued over what exactly had been found beneath the Watzmann. A Cold War biosphere, a continuity of government shelter, a failed ecology experiment, a sealed population, an unauthorized security state inside a mountain. Fragments of all of these were true. None of them were complete. Adrian Voss gave formal testimony once before his health collapsed. It was careful, devastating, and still incomplete in places where his own guilt had worn grooves too deep for language to fill. Petra remained Petra, precise, furious, and unimpressed by any official who tried to describe abandonment as protocol. Anna built the release timeline that prevented the first counter-narrative from settling into dominance. Hannah authenticated images. Miriam returned long enough to confirm the pollen work and then disappeared from the public story again by choice. And Karen. Karen never adapted fully to the world above, though that sentence was too small for what it meant. Sometimes she spoke with dry clarity about vents, sectors, and artificial dawn cycles. Sometimes she went silent in rooms with normal windows because ordinary weather moved too randomly for her to trust. She gave testimony in fragments. She corrected dates no calendar should have preserved. She never once referred to herself as a miracle. When asked by one interviewer what had kept her alive, she answered only routine, stubbornness, and the refusal to let someone else write the final sentence. Months later, a national paper ran a full-page reproduction of the 1994 Valley photograph. Most readers saw what they had already learned to see: the lost climbers, the impossible biome, the broadleaf plants, the contradictory shadows. A few noticed something else. Deep in the background, slightly out of focus near the edge of the frame, stood a figure in modern field uniform, too modern for 1994. Its insignia blurred but suggestive of the same circular emblem, with twin offset shadows later recovered near Petra's garden. No official explanation has ever fully accounted for that figure. Was it a later contamination of archived material, a boundary overlap from a time the dome itself failed to understand, or proof that the hidden system beneath the mountain had been crossing its own eras long before the climbers vanished into it? Even now, no answer has settled with enough certainty to end the question. And perhaps that is the final truth the Votsman keeps for itself. Not whether something was hidden there. That is no longer in doubt. But how long the hidden world had been looking back before anyone realized the ice was not only preserving the past, it was delaying it. If this story stayed with you, stay with the channel. Subscribe, leave your thoughts in the comments, and tell us what you think that figure in the photograph really means. Because sometimes the mystery is not what disappeared beneath the mountain, but what was waiting there long before anyone arrived.